Shut your eyes and picture a place you've never laid eyes on. Not because it's distant, but because it disappeared 12 millennia ago. A realm so strange, so unbelievably unlike the present that being placed there would leave you unable to identify the planet. The date is 10,000 BCE. Glacial layers loom above the northern landmasses, several miles deep, with more weight than mountain ranges, creeping southward like icy earth movers, remolding the planet. Across North America, glaciers blanket the region from the Arctic Ocean all the way to where Manhattan will eventually appear. In Europe, ice covers Scandinavia, the British Isles, and much of Germany beneath heavy sheets of white. The enormous pressure forces the very continents to depress, buckling under countless billions of tons of solid ice. Sea levels are 400 feet beneath modern times, not 40, but a full 400. Strolling where Miami's shores will one day form, you'd be 60 miles away from the coast. There is no English Channel at all. Great Britain and France are joined by a vast expanse of grassy plains. Indonesia is not an archipelago. It forms a portion of the Asian continent. A land bridge broader than Texas allows you to travel on foot from Siberia to Alaska, and the cold, the harsh, unyielding chill that characterizes existence. Worldwide average temperatures are 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit below current levels. That may appear modest, yet it separates settled life from glacial epochs, urban centers from mere endurance. Yet here is what renders this epoch truly astonishing. The creatures, beings of such size and strength that present-day fauna seems docile, woolly mammoths, 13 feet at the shoulder with tusks curving 15 feet in length, travel in herds over the icy plains. Massive ground sloths, comparable to elephants, rear up on their back legs to pull branches off trees. Saber-toothed felines armed with 8-inch canine teeth are flawlessly adapted for penetrating thick skin and heavy musculature, while cave bears tip the scales at 3,000 pounds. Dire wolves pursue prey in groups, numbering several dozen. Bison boast horn spreads of 7 feet. Terror birds, flightless hunters, 10 feet tall, possess beaks shaped like axes. This is the Pleistocene epoch, the planet's most recent glacial period. A world frozen solid for more than 100,000 years. Dwelling within this icy expanse, spread in small clans throughout the regions that could support life, are humans, your forebears. Far from simplistic cave dwellers groping in the gloom, they are skilled hunters equipped with advanced implements, refined garments, creative works, and developed society. They have become so thoroughly accustomed to the glacial conditions that this frozen environment is their only reality, and they consider it home. If you are listening to this to drift off to sleep, that is precisely the purpose behind creating such content. So perhaps subscribe and share your current location and the time there. I go through the comments and find them intriguing. Tokyo at dawn, London during midday, Los Angeles at midnight, everyone experiencing the same narrative as it develops. Leave a comment because I am truly interested in where across the globe you are at this moment. Thus, humankind flourishes in the glacial era, wildlife flourishes as well, and the planet has reached a harsh yet steady balance. Yet then, around 12,000 years in the past, a shift occurs. A catalyst sets off an occurrence so devastating, so swift, so utterly overpowering that within just a handful of generations, it will transform every corner of the globe. The frozen masses start to thaw. Not gradually, not little by little, in geological perspective, nearly instantaneously. Over just a few thousand years, sometimes even in a matter of centuries, those glaciers, a mile deep, begin to fall apart. Huge ice sheets that required 100,000 years to form vanish in what feels like the blink of an eye on a cosmic scale. That water from melting ice has to find a place to go. Picture the biggest floods humanity has ever recorded. Now take those floods and make them 1,000, even 10,000 times bigger. Walls of water rose hundreds of feet, raging across entire continents. Lakes as vast as oceans broke through ice barriers and emptied out in just a few weeks. Shorelines disappear as the sea climbs 400 feet, devouring vast stretches of territory where people had made their homes for many generations. And amidst all this confusion, during the swift change from an icy planet to the one we recognize now, another event unfolds. The great beasts perish. In a span of just a few thousand years, nearly all of Earth's large animals become extinct. The woolly mammoths vanish. The enormous ground sloths disappear as well. The saber-toothed cats, the terrifying terror birds, cave bears, dire wolves, and huge bison, they're all gone. More than 150 species of megafauna wiped out. Animals that had endured several ice ages and flourished for millions of years simply disappear from the fossil layers. This is the biggest extinction event since the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs. But there was something different this time. Not an asteroid, not one big disastrous collision, only ice melting and oceans rising. And somehow, that transformation destroyed the giant animals, yet spared humans. Against all odds, humans didn't just survive this global disaster, we flourished. We adapted and spread rapidly to every corner of the world. Within just a few thousand years after the Ice Age ended, we developed farming, constructed towns, and formed civilization. Everything surrounding you now, every accomplishment of humanity, can be traced back to the actions of our ancestors exactly as the Ice Age came to a close. So, what caused the ice to melt? Why did temperatures shoot up so abruptly after 100,000 years of steadiness? What produced floods so enormous that they completely altered the shape of continents? Why did massive animals that had made it through many climate shifts suddenly disappear? And how did humans, who are rather small and fragile next to the giant creatures, not only endure but become the rulers of the planet? The clues are hidden within ice cores taken from Greenland, in the sediment layers deep beneath old lake beds, in the remains of long-gone giant animals. And they are also found in the DNA of each and every living person. This is the tale of the greatest climate shift in human history, the instant when Earth ceased to be a frozen world and turned into the planet we recognize today. This is what took place when the ice ages came to an end 12,000 years ago. 20,000 years in the past, Earth was an entirely alien world, not just in a figurative sense, but truly physically changed from the one we live on now. If you could somehow journey back to that era, you would hardly believe it was the same planet. This was the Last Glacial Maximum, the chilliest and iciest phase of the most recent ice age. It was the world that our ancestors received after their lengthy evolutionary path. Let's begin with the ice itself, since it was ice that determined everything about this era. The enormous size of the ice sheets blanketing the planet is nearly beyond our understanding. This isn't about small glaciers in mountain valleys or the polar ice caps. Rather, it's about continental-sized ice sheets, thousands of feet thick. These massive ice layers stretched over millions of square miles and sculpted entire terrains beneath their unimaginable weight. Take the Laurentide ice sheet all by itself, centered over Hudson Bay. It blanketed nearly all of Canada and extended far into the area that is now the northern United States. Picture ice stretching from the Arctic Ocean all the way down to New York, to Pennsylvania, to the Great Lakes region. In certain regions, that ice measured more than 2 miles in thickness. That immense burden of frozen water compressed the underlying bedrock, deforming the Earth's crust below. It pulverized entire mountain ranges and carved out valleys hundreds of feet deep. On the other side of the Atlantic, the Fennoscandian ice cap covered northern Europe, with Britain, Scandinavia, northern Germany, and Poland all lying beneath a thick layer of ice. The pressure was so immense that Scandinavia continues to rebound even now, rising by a measurable amount each year as the land gradually recovers its former form. 10,000 years after the ice had vanished, Asia had its own massive ice sheets. Vast ice sheets stretched across Siberia and the interior mountain ranges. The Himalayas held glaciers so enormous that today's mountain ice fields seem like mere trimmings in comparison. South America also saw ice sheets reaching far north from Antarctica, blanketing Patagonia and the southern Andes. This massive accumulation of ice signified something remarkable. Water on Earth never vanishes, it merely shifts. And every molecule of water frozen in those continental glaciers had originated elsewhere. That somewhere was the ocean. So during the peak of the last ice age, sea levels stood about 400 feet lower than they are now. 400 feet, just take a moment to absorb that. The configuration of all coastlines on Earth was drastically altered. That dramatic fall in sea level revealed vast expanses of what is today underwater as solid, dry ground. These were no mere skinny beach strips. They were enormous regions, entire subcontinents that have since disappeared. To the north, a landmass known as Beringia joined Asia and North America in the place now occupied by the Bering Strait. Yet Beringia was much more than a simple land bridge. This was a huge expanse, perhaps 1,000 miles from north to south. It formed a wholly separate ecological area that harbored its own distinct communities of flora and fauna. Spanning the area between Britain and mainland Europe lay Doggerland, a flat, low-lying region that linked today's islands into an unbroken landmass. Archaeological findings indicate that this was excellent hunting ground during the Ice Age, abundant in resources, interlaced with waterways, and teeming with large herds of grazing animals. In Southeast Asia, the continental shelf, left uncovered, gave rise to Sundaland, which united Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines as one giant landmass. Australia and New Guinea were fused together into Sahul. The Mediterranean Sea was significantly reduced in size. The Persian Gulf existed as a river valley. The global map appeared completely foreign, yet it wasn't only the ice and newly revealed land that set this world apart. The climate system itself had been entirely reshaped. Enormous ice caps generated their own local weather systems, disrupting atmospheric currents and impacting the whole globe. The jet streams, those swift aerial currents that steer weather patterns over continents, were forced much farther south by the ice. Consequently, areas that are now temperate endured Ice Age climates. Southern Europe, typically warm and Mediterranean, experienced weather similar to present-day Scandinavia. The Sahara, currently among the most arid regions on the planet, saw an entirely different precipitation regime. Areas that today are endless dunes once hosted grasslands and isolated trees. The Amazon rainforest, that vast powerhouse of Earth's biological variety, shrank into fragmented refuges divided by dry savanna. Ocean currents also changed. The immense global conveyor system that transfers heat across the planet followed new, modified routes. Cold meltwater from the ice margins triggered nutrient-dense upwellings in new places, altering the areas where fish gathered. That shifted seabird nesting grounds, which rippled through coastal ecosystems, setting off successive waves of change. This was a planet of extremes, where seasonal contrasts were far more intense than what we know now. Ice Age winters could stretch 8 or 9 months, with cold so severe that an exposed person would perish within minutes. Summers were short, yet packed with activity, as plants and animals had just a few weeks to thrive and reproduce. Everything that needed to survive and pass on its genes had to do so quickly. In this altered world, a one-of-a-kind ecosystem developed, not simply a chillier version of today's habitats. It was something truly unlike anything we see in the modern era. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, a nearly continuous belt stretching from Spain to Canada, the biggest biome ever known on Earth. Imagine endless grassy plains, but different from the African savanna or American prairies. It was colder, drier, and more wide open. Scattered clumps of tough trees, mostly evergreens, broke up the scenery. In summer, wildflowers would briefly paint the ground with vivid colors. When winter came, everything turned into a frozen desert where only the hardiest creatures could endure, and what remarkable creatures they were. The megafauna of the Ice Age, the huge animals that ruled this icy world, they had no equivalents living today. They weren't simply species that had adapted to the cold. They were completely different, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years evolving under Ice Age conditions. The most famous, naturally, were the woolly mammoths. These were far more than hairy elephants. They were masterfully designed survival machines of the Ice Age, standing up to 13 feet at the shoulder. They had 2 layers of fur, with the outer layer reaching almost 3 feet long on some individuals. Their curved tusks could grow over 15 feet in length. Those tusks weren't just for show or fighting. Mammoths used them as tools, sweeping away snow to uncover plants, breaking ice to get to water, and even defending themselves from predators. Mammoth social life resembled that of modern elephants. Matriarchal herds of related females and their young, while males formed bachelor groups or lived alone. But their behavior was suited to the extreme seasonal shifts of the Ice Age. They had to keep moving, following the brief burst of plant growth over huge distances. Their migrations were timed to the seasons with a precision born from the pressures of evolution. And they weren't the only ones. Woolly rhinoceroses, just as impressive and well-adapted, shared those same grasslands. These were enormous animals, some over 6,000 pounds, with two horns, the front one reaching more than 3 feet long and the largest. Like mammoths, they had thick woolly coats, but unlike mammoths, they were solitary and apparently more aggressive. Cave paintings and preserved remains show they were formidable beasts that even the biggest predators approached carefully. Speaking of predators, the Ice Age had hunters that would make modern big cats seem modest. Saber-toothed cats, several species, actually had mastered the art of taking down megafauna. Their famous long canine teeth, up to 7 inches in some species, weren't used like modern cat bites. They were precise tools for severing major blood vessels and windpipes. A saber-tooth would grapple its prey, use its powerful neck and shoulder muscles to hold steady, and then deliver a surgical strike to vital areas with those specialized teeth. Cave lions, bigger than any lion alive today, hunted in prides across Europe and Asia. Their prey differed from modern lions. They targeted young mammoths, bison, horses, and even rhinos when they could catch them at a vulnerable moment. Skeletal evidence shows incredible strength. Cave lion bones are denser and more robust than modern lions, suggesting they could bring down prey that would be impossible for today's predators. In North America, dire wolves roamed the Ice Age landscapes in packs. These weren't just oversized wolves, they were a distinct species, more heavily built than modern gray wolves, with bone-crushing jaws adapted for a different hunting style. While modern wolves rely on endurance and teamwork to wear down prey, dire wolves were more like hyenas, using raw power and strong jaws to disable and consume their kills. This involved breaking bones open to get at the marrow. As for the animals they hunted, aside from mammoths and rhinos, there was an incredible variety of megafauna. Massive ground sloths, with certain species growing up to 20 feet tall when on their hind legs, fed on leaves and bushes. Contrary to what their name suggests, they were far from sluggish or awkward. Reconstructions show they were truly fearsome, with strong limbs ending in huge claws that could fend off even the biggest hunters. Glyptodons, essentially giant armadillos as large as small cars, had shells composed of thousands of bony plates fused into armor that could withstand most attacks. 8-foot-long giant beavers constructed dams and lodges in rivers during the Ice Age. Enormous bison, with horns that could span close to 7 feet, roamed in herds across the grassy plains. Cave bears, which were different from today's bears, spent winters asleep in European caves. Their numbers were so great that certain cave systems were used by thousands of these animals over thousands of years, accumulating layers upon layers of remains. For the most part, these creatures were plant eaters, in spite of their enormous size and strength. Still, their massive bulk meant they could be perilous if provoked. Down in Australia, the megafauna were even stranger. Diprotodon, the biggest marsupial to have ever existed, resembled a colossal wombat and tipped the scales at more than 6,000 pounds. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, may have been the strongest predator relative to its size ever to evolve. Its bite packed more force, pound for pound, than even the saber-toothed cats could manage. The whole ecosystem, from the tiniest rodents right up to the biggest mammoths, was finely tuned. These megafauna weren't simply dwellers of the Ice Age landscape. They acted as ecosystem engineers, constantly molding their surroundings. Mammoths would topple trees, preserving the open grasslands that sustained the vast herds. Their droppings enriched the ground and carried seeds far and wide. And when they perished, their huge bodies became meals for scavengers and released nutrients back into the earth in rich pockets. These ancient grasslands were completely different from anything we see now. Today's tundra tends to be boggy and soaked, with only sparse plant life. The Ice Age steppe was much drier and more fertile, able to sustain the massive animal populations that relied on it. The mix of cold weather, scarce rain, and endless nibbling by herbivores gave rise to a distinctive mix of plants, mostly tough grasses, along with sedges and herbs that could endure the long winter freeze, as well as the constant grazing by millions of plant eaters. And into this world, humans had managed to carve out a place, not merely hanging on at the edges, but actually flourishing as top predators and one of the planet's most accomplished species. By 20,000 years ago, people had dispersed into nearly every Ice Age habitat, from the fringes of the massive continental ice sheets down to the warmer tropical zones. However, the humans who lived during the Last Glacial Maximum differed from us in significant ways, though not in their biology. They had the same modern anatomy and mental capabilities that we possess. Yet culturally, they had turned into experts at making it through the Ice Age, crafting tools and methods. This made them possibly the most fearsome hunters the world had ever witnessed. In Europe, folks were constructing elaborate homes out of mammoth bones. These were no simple wind barriers. They were carefully designed buildings that used hundreds of bones, chosen and placed with precision, then covered with animal skins and insulated with soil and sod. A number of these dwellings were large enough to house several families over the whole winter. Excavations reveal traces of central fireplaces, storage spaces, and even distinct areas set aside for various chores. The tools of Ice Age hunters were incredibly advanced. They made spear tips using methods that present-day flint knappers find challenging to copy. The finest specimens demonstrate a grasp of stone fracture mechanics that would impress even today's materials engineers. This wasn't mere random rock chipping. They meticulously shaped stone cores, striking off exactly the right flakes in carefully planned orders, fashioning tools that balanced peak performance with conservation of resources. The atlatl, a spear-throwing device that functioned as this extension of the arm boosted throwing force tremendously. An experienced hunter wielding an atlatl could hurl a spear more than 100 yards, packing enough energy to pierce heavy animal skin. As a result, people could take down perilous prey from a safer range, lowering the hazards of hunting large Ice Age creatures. They crafted dedicated implements for butchering, precision scrapers for treating skins, bone needles for stitching tailored garments. Additionally, they invented engraving instruments to adorn items with symbolic patterns. Every single tool embodied centuries of collected wisdom, methods honed through traditions that were shared and progressively enhanced. Yet, the most significant breakthrough might have been social. Unlike their forerunners, Ice Age communities formed bigger, better networked bands. They sustained exchange routes that transported raw stone over vast distances. Flint from particular mines appears in artifacts found at locations that are weeks of walking apart. Shells from the Atlantic shoreline turn up at settlements deep inside Europe. Baltic amber reaches as far as the south of France. These connections were about more than swapping goods. They enabled the flow of knowledge. An innovation from one band could travel across thousands of kilometers in the span of a single generation. Ideas now built upon each other at an unprecedented pace. Whenever an individual discovered a superior method for curing leather, a more efficient hunting tactic, or an enhanced shelter layout, that insight could disseminate throughout all human societies. At the same time, they were forging a rich, symbolic culture. The cave art from this era displays stunning artistic talent and keen insight into the habits of animals. The renowned murals in France's Lascaux and Chauvet caves are far from primitive stick drawings. They are complex, vivid depictions that convey the very spirit of Ice Age fauna, with a precision that reveals a profound familiarity with these beasts. Sculpted statuettes, musical implements fashioned from bone and ivory, ornamental beads, and pendants all indicate that these people enjoyed leisure beyond bare subsistence. They were actively building culture, transmitting customs, and forging unique community identities. Variations across regions in artistic and tool-making traditions point to the rise of what we could call ethnic or cultural identities, and they thrived immensely so. During the peak of the last Ice Age, the global human population reached hundreds of thousands, possibly a few million. They inhabited every large continent except Antarctica. They had adapted to habitats ranging from the frozen Arctic to steamy tropics. They hunted the biggest, most fearsome creatures on Earth, and they were consistently victorious. Yet their accomplishments teetered on a delicate equilibrium. The whole Ice Age environment, with its splendid megafauna, sweeping grasslands, and finely tuned species hinged on a single essential condition: Staying unchanged. The ice. So long as the climate remained frigid, the ice sheets stayed steady, and the mammoth steppe endured, this realm could last forever. Creatures had been adapting to glacial environments for hundreds of millennia. Humans had spent thousands of years refining their Ice Age survival techniques. The icy planet had become the only environment people knew. This was simply how existence was. The humans of 20,000 years ago had no memory of a different climate. For hundreds of generations, their ancestors, stretching back to distant times, had experienced nothing but the Ice Age. Every skill they employed, every animal they hunted, every plant they gathered, was perfectly attuned to this frozen realm. Yet, deep within Greenland's ice cores and the sedimentary layers of ancient lakes, a change was approaching. In the growth rings of long-dead trees, a shift was coming, faint at first, almost undetectable. Minor alterations in solar radiation patterns, subtle shifts in atmospheric circulation, slight changes in ocean currents. Alone, these changes meant nothing. Together, they marked the start of a transformation so swift, so dramatic, so complete, that it would permanently destroy the Ice Age world and reshape the Earth into something entirely new. The frozen planet, which had seemed everlasting, was about to discover it was anything but. And the species that had adapted so perfectly to Ice Age conditions, including the most adaptable species of all, were about to face a test unlike any their ancestors had survived. The Great Thaw had begun. So there they stood, 20,000 years ago. Modern humans, the only survivors of 3 human species that had emerged from that ancient bottleneck. They had spread across the globe from Africa's southern tip to the frozen steppes of Siberia. They had developed complex languages, sophisticated tools, and social networks that reached across continents. They were perfectly suited to the Ice Age world. And then everything began to change. The trigger was not obvious at first. There was no single moment when the Ice Age decided to end. No dramatic event announced the transformation ahead. The climate had been fluctuating for hundreds of thousands of years. Warm periods were followed by cold snaps. Cold snaps were followed by brief respites. The humans and animals living through it had no reason to think this time would be any different. But it was different. Catastrophically different. The true cause of what was about to happen began not on Earth, but in the geometry of Earth's orbit around the Sun. It is one of those beautiful cosmic accidents that shapes everything about life on our planet, yet remains completely invisible to anyone living through it. Scientists call them Milankovitch cycles, named after the Serbian mathematician who first worked them out in the 1920s. There are 3 of them, 3 different ways Earth's orbit and rotation shift over time. They alter how much solar radiation reaches different parts of the planet. First, there is eccentricity. Earth's orbit around the Sun is not a perfect circle. It is an ellipse, sometimes more circular, sometimes more elongated. This cycle takes about 100,000 years to complete. When the orbit is more elliptical, Earth's distance from the Sun varies more dramatically over the year, intensifying seasonal differences. Second, there is obliquity, the tilt of Earth's axis. Right now, we are tilted at about 23.5 degrees, but the angle is not constant. It varies between 22.1 degrees and 24.5 degrees over a cycle that takes 41,000 years. A greater axial tilt leads to more intense seasonal contrasts, while a smaller tilt brings gentler seasons. Then there is precession, the gradual, wobbling motion of Earth's axis. Not unlike a spinning top that begins to lose momentum, Earth sways as it rotates. It takes roughly 26,000 years for this wobble to finish one complete cycle. It also governs which hemisphere gets angled toward the Sun at different points along Earth's orbital path. Individually, none of these cycles seems especially remarkable. However, when they synchronize, when all 3 work together to amplify their effects, they can nudge Earth's climate either into an ice age or out of one. Over the last 2.5 million years, these cycles have steered the planet through many alternating glacial and interglacial eras. Ice ages would develop gradually over tens of millennia as the cycles combine to lessen the amount of summer sunlight reaching the northern hemisphere. With reduced summer sunshine, the winter snow would not completely thaw. Year by year, the snow piled up, compacted into ice, and eventually created those enormous ice sheets that blanketed half of the land masses. But the cycles continued to operate. They persisted, kept changing, and sooner or later, they would line up in the opposite direction. More summer sunlight would strike the northern hemisphere, bringing mildly higher temperatures just sufficient to initiate melting along the margins of the ice sheets. Approximately 19,000 years in the past, that very process began. The arrangement of Earth's orbit had changed to a state that provided increased solar energy to the northern half of the globe during the summer months. It wasn't a huge increase, perhaps only 5% above the chilliest times, but it sufficed. The vast ice sheets, which had been expanding for more than 100,000 years, at last ceased their forward march. The fronts of these glaciers, those towering ice cliffs that had been creeping southward annually, started to become stable. For several millennia, there was little further change. The ice masses were not expanding, yet neither were they rapidly retreating. They simply remained in place, huge and seemingly everlasting elements of the scenery. Anyone alive during that time would have observed nothing out of the ordinary. The planet remained icy, and winters continued to be harsh. The ice still ruled the skyline as it always had. Yet below the surface, transformations were underway. The amount of summer melt began to surpass the snow and ice that accumulated in winter only by a tiny margin initially, just a few centimeters annually. But those centimeters accumulated. Water from melting started seeping out from the edges of the ice sheets, and tiny trickles grew into streams, then rivers. These rivers cut pathways through the landscape. These landscape channels would transport increasing amounts of meltwater as the thaw sped up. By 18,000 years ago, the ice's withdrawal was impossible to ignore. The ice sheets were diminishing, and ocean levels started to climb as previously trapped water made its way back into the seas. The changes were gradual, nearly unnoticeable within a single human lifespan. Perhaps sea levels rose about 1 meter every 100 years, and the ice sheets retreated perhaps 2 kilometers per annum. None of this would have alarmed people experiencing it. Yet it was indeed occurring, and the Great Thaw had initiated. And then came a time when conditions seemed poised to proceed steadily toward the warm era we enjoy today, with the Milankovitch cycles apparently in place. The ice should have continued its steady melt for the coming millennia, yet, contrary to expectations, something wholly unforeseen occurred. Around 12,900 years ago, smack in the middle of that warming phase, Earth suddenly reverted to Ice Age conditions. Within just a few decades, maybe even years, the northern hemisphere's temperatures fell almost to glacial standards. The ice sheets, which had been withdrawing, abruptly halted, and in certain areas they even began to push forward again. This event is known to scientists as the Younger Dryas, after a tiny Arctic blossom that unexpectedly showed up in pollen samples from that time. The term sounds mild, perhaps even lovely, but it was anything but. The Younger Dryas was a climatic disaster, a millennium-long halt to the warming trend that, based on the orbital cycles, should never have happened. And no one is entirely certain what triggered it. Well, that's not entirely accurate. There are theories, quite a few, but the evidence is conflicting, debated, and in certain instances, truly strange. The Younger Dryas remains one of paleoclimatology's biggest enigmas, and unraveling it is crucial because the cause behind it might one day repeat itself. The leading explanation centers on the North Atlantic and the massive ocean conveyor system that moves water across the globe. This ocean conveyor relies on variations in density. Warm, salty, tropical waters travel northwards to the Arctic, where they cool, grow denser, and plunge to the bottom of the sea. That descending motion powers the whole belt, drawing more warm water north to fill the void. Yet what would occur if enormous volumes of fresh water were abruptly released into the North Atlantic? Fresh water is lighter than salt water, so it doesn't sink readily. Should the North Atlantic receive a massive influx of fresh water, the entire circulation could be brought to a halt. Around when the Younger Dryas commenced, a vast glacial lake occupied the heart of North America. This body of water was Lake Agassiz, named for the geologist who first found signs of its existence. This was no ordinary lake. At its largest, it surpassed all of today's Great Lakes put together. It held more water than every current lake on Earth combined, restrained by an enormous ice barrier. The theory proceeds as follows. As the ice sheets melted, the ice dam grew weak. Then, approximately 12,900 years ago, it suffered a catastrophic collapse. Lake Agassiz drained into the North Atlantic over just a few months, perhaps even weeks. Hundreds of thousands of cubic kilometers of freshwater surged into the sea all at once. This deluge, epic in its proportions, brought the ocean conveyor to a standstill and sent the northern hemisphere back into icy conditions. The trouble is, the evidence isn't entirely consistent. Some North Atlantic sediment cores indicate the expected freshwater flood at the correct moment. Others do not. The chronology is unclear. Additionally, there are signs that Lake Agassiz had already discharged eastward into the Atlantic prior to the Younger Dryas, not while it was ongoing. Thus, some scientists have suggested more spectacular causes. In the early 2000s, a research team put forward evidence for an asteroid strike. They uncovered a sediment layer from the beginning of the Younger Dryas holding odd substances: nanodiamonds, platinum, iridium, and magnetic microspherules. Most fascinating were hexagonal diamonds, which only occur under hypervelocity impacts. That's how they saw it. About 12,900 years ago, a comet or asteroid disintegrated within Earth's atmosphere. It then detonated above the North American ice sheet. The collision, or more probably multiple collisions, melted vast ice quantities, ignited extensive wildfires, and lofted enough debris into the sky to darken the sun and set off swift cooling. This hypothesis is, to say the least, hotly debated. Other experts have doubted that these peculiar materials necessarily demand an impact as their explanation. Nanodiamonds can be produced in wildfires. Platinum spikes could stem from volcanic activity. As for hexagonal diamonds, some researchers argue they're simply earthly substances that were wrongly labeled. Still, the impact hypothesis persists because fresh evidence keeps emerging. Signs of impacts appear in sediment layers across several continents, and there are indications of vast fires in North America precisely at the right moment. Moreover, a curious pattern emerges. Many of the large mammals that vanished in that era did so exactly at the Younger Dryas boundary. Additionally, the volcanic hypothesis exists. Several scientists highlight huge eruptions occurring at that time. Eruptions that might have released sufficient sulfur dioxide and ash into the stratosphere to bring about substantial global cooling. And indeed, evidence of significant volcanic events in Iceland, Indonesia, and Central America has been found for that key interval. Yet, what makes the Younger Dryas so puzzling is that perhaps every theory holds a piece of truth. Perhaps there wasn't just one trigger, but rather a perfect storm of multiple factors occurring together. Orbital cycles were setting the stage. Vulnerable conditions were set in motion. Ice sheets collapsed and flooded the North Atlantic. An asteroid strike introduced more chaos. Volcanic eruptions intensified the cooling. Everything unfolded over a few centuries, maybe even decades. Regardless of the initial cause, once the Younger Dryas began, once this severe cold period started, feedback loops took charge and magnified the effects. This is where climate science becomes genuinely alarming, revealing how rapidly conditions can deteriorate after crossing certain thresholds. A key feedback involved ice and snow. Those fresh white surfaces send sunlight back into space, a phenomenon known as the albedo effect. As the Earth cooled during the Younger Dryas, snow and ice started to spread over regions that were once bare ground or tundra. These new white areas bounced back more sunlight, dropping temperatures even more, enabling further snow and ice buildup, which in turn reflected even greater amounts of sunlight. This created a runaway cooling loop. Then there was the permafrost feedback, which worked in reverse after the cold period concluded. Permafrost soil that remains frozen year-round holds vast quantities of organic material, dead plants and animals that were frozen before they could decay completely. When permafrost melts, microbes become active and begin decomposing that organic matter, emitting methane and carbon dioxide. Methane is a greenhouse gas roughly 25 times more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. As the warming returned after the Younger Dryas ceased, Enormous expanses of permafrost across Siberia, Canada, and Alaska began to thaw. The subsequent methane emissions likely sped up the warming considerably. Greenland ice cores reveal that atmospheric methane levels almost doubled in the period immediately following the end of the Younger Dryas. Ocean circulation formed another feedback loop. When the North Atlantic circulation halted during the Younger Dryas, the cooling wasn't limited to the northern hemisphere. It also altered tropical rain patterns, transformed wind flows over the Atlantic, and impacted monsoon cycles in Asia and Africa. When the circulation restarted, all those patterns changed once more, causing chaotic weather across several continents. Forest cover also contributed to the dynamics. Throughout the cold spell, forests retreated in many regions, giving way to tundra and grasslands. Since trees are darker than grassland, they soak up more sunlight and heat up the surrounding environment. The loss of forest cover removed a source of warmth. However, when temperatures rebounded, forests grew back vigorously, their dark canopies capturing sunlight and speeding up local temperature rise. All these feedbacks interplayed in intricate ways, forming what climate researchers refer to as tipping points, thresholds, past which change becomes self-sustaining and possibly permanent. The unsettling truth is that we still lack a complete understanding of where these tipping points lie, or what sets them off. The Younger Dryas demonstrated that Earth's climate can shift states with remarkable speed, quicker than any slow orbital changes could account for. So how is all this known? How can scientists piece together events from 12,000 years ago with such precision? The answer resides in some of science's most impressive detective efforts. Various strands of evidence from entirely separate origins each recount different pieces of the same narrative. Ice cores are considered the benchmark. Researchers have drilled deep into the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica. Scientists pull out long ice cylinders that hold an intricate chronicle of Earth's climate, stretching back hundreds of millennia. Every winter's snowfall adds a separate, identifiable layer. Counting those layers lets researchers build exact timelines. Studying the ice's composition reveals what temperatures were like long ago. Tiny air bubbles within the ice hold real samples of the ancient sky, revealing levels of greenhouse gases. Thin bands of dust and volcanic ash pinpoint particular occurrences. A Greenland ice core reveals the Younger Dryas period with remarkable clarity. The thermometer dropped by 15 degrees Celsius in under 10 years. Methane levels in the air plummeted. Dust grew thick as plants withered and winds swept away bare ground. After 12 centuries, heat surged upward once more at an even faster pace, perhaps regaining half the lost warmth within just 3 years. Cores from lake and seafloor sediments bring another side of the tale. Water basins steadily gather sediment deposits each passing year. Every strata holds pollen, tiny creatures, chemical clues, and occasionally bigger fossils. Such cores show how entire ecosystems reacted to shifting climates. In the Younger Dryas, pollen evidence indicates that Europe's mild forests turned into Arctic tundra in just a few decades. Pines that were spreading northward abruptly vanished, giving way to tiny willows and grasses. Ocean sediment cores reveal shifts in sea currents. The proportion of oxygen isotopes within microscopic marine shells provides clues about water, warmth, and saltiness. These indirect markers pinpoint the moment the North Atlantic current shut down and later kicked back to life. They also map where fresh water gushed into the sea and how fast it dispersed. Stalactites and stalagmites in caves capture yet another story. They build up over time from dripping water, and their chemistry mirrors rainfall and temperature changes. In certain Chinese caves, stalagmites formed continuously through the whole ice age and up to today. Their chemical bands reveal how monsoons across Asia changed during the Younger Dryas, demonstrating that the climate upheaval affected not just one area, but the entire world. Fossil DNA opens another window. Stored in permafrost, lake mud, and even the stomachs of frozen creatures, this genetic material tells us what animals and plants were present. It reveals when and where animals moved, populations plummeted, or diets shifted. Mammoth DNA indicates that their numbers were falling even before the Younger Dryas began, likely because of prior warming. However, the sudden chill and the quick heat-up that followed finished them off. Growth rings in trees give us yearly details for the more recent chapters. Old tree trunks preserved in swamps and lakes display yearly growth patterns, mirroring climate ups and downs. During the Younger Dryas, those trees' growth slowed dramatically. Once the cold episode ceased, growth surged. Trees added inches of wood annually instead of mere fractions. Artifacts and digs reveal people's reactions, with living arrangements shifting noticeably. Over in the Middle East, folks who had roamed as hunter-gatherers started forming permanent settlements. This shift coincided precisely with the close of the Younger Dryas. The pressure from swift climate shifts may have nudged them into farming as natural food grew scarce. Across the Atlantic, the Clovis people, famous for their elegant stone spear tips, vanished right at the Younger Dryas boundary. They were succeeded by other cultures, with new tools and ways of life. When we combine every clue, a vivid portrait emerges of how the Ice Age gave way to today's world. This transition was anything but smooth. It was chaotic and violent, characterized by sudden shifts between different climate states, and the most dramatic transformations were yet to come. You see, when the Younger Dryas finally concluded roughly 11,700 years ago, the warming didn't simply pick up where it left off. It sped up dramatically. The feedback loops that had been suppressed during that cold period suddenly activated altogether. Ice sheets that had remained stable throughout the Younger Dryas started breaking apart at a pace never seen before. The permafrost, which had frozen again, now thawed with explosive force, and ocean currents, previously sluggish, came surging back to full strength. The Earth was on the verge of changing more rapidly than it had in the past 100 millennia. In the way of this massive shift stood the colossal ice sheets, now unstable and cracking, ready to unleash floods far greater than any recorded in human history. The true disaster was just about to start. The ice was beginning to melt. When billions upon billions of tons of ice begin to shift, they do so with incredible force. Around 14,000 years ago, as temperatures steadily rose from the depths of the Last Glacial Maximum, the enormous ice sheets that had covered the northern hemisphere for 100,000 years began to crumble. Not slowly, nor in a predictable manner, but in devastating surges that would redraw the map of continents and submerge the world as humans knew it. First, you need to grasp the sheer magnitude. This isn't like an ice cube dissolving in your drink. We're talking about ice sheets over 2 miles thick that stretched across entire continents. The Laurentide ice sheet alone extended from the Arctic Ocean all the way to present-day New York City, and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. It held so much frozen water that it could raise global sea levels by 200 feet, and this ice was disintegrating. But the meltwater couldn't simply drain away. The ice sheets had created a dilemma of their own making. As these ice sheets grew, they scraped and gouged the land underneath, forming vast basins and valleys. They also obstructed river systems that had been flowing for millions of years. So when the ice melted, all that water had no natural outlet. The water pooled and gathered, creating lakes of staggering proportions, held back by ice dams that were themselves gradually falling apart. The biggest among them was Glacial Lake Agassiz. If you combined all 5 Great Lakes together, they would be less than half the area that Lake Agassiz covered at its peak. This one lake stretched across parts of modern-day Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, and Minnesota. It measured 700 miles in length, and in some places 250 miles wide, with depths exceeding 2,000 feet. This lake held more fresh water than all of today's lakes on Earth put together, and the only thing keeping it contained was an ice dam. Just pause to consider that. A body of water bigger than the Black Sea, held back only by walls of ice that were steadily melting as the climate warmed. The ice dam didn't have to vanish entirely. All it needed was a single crack, a weak point, one opening that would let the immense pressure behind it take over. About 13,000 years ago, along the southern edge of the ice sheet, that breach happened. What followed was nothing short of apocalyptic. The initial failure was sudden, likely set off by an especially warm summer or an earthquake caused by the rebounding land. Once the opening appeared, the pressure from billions of gallons of water behind it would have torn it wider in just minutes. In a matter of hours, A minor leak turned into a raging torrent that swept along ice chunks as big as houses. Within days, the entire southern portion of the ice dam gave way. Lake Agassiz did not simply drain away. A massive explosion occurred, and water surged from the breach with a force that modern times can hardly compare to. To give you an idea, the mighty Mississippi River, among the planet's greatest waterways, flows at roughly 600,000 cubic feet each second. But at the height of the Lake Agassiz deluge, the water rushed at an astonishing 15 to 30 million cubic feet per second. This was equivalent to 25 to 50 times the total water flow of every river on Earth, all concentrated within a few devastating weeks. Those raging waters cut entirely new pathways, digging hundreds of feet deep into solid rock. These floods transported enormous boulders, each as large as a bus, across hundreds of miles. They also scoured away the fertile topsoil that had slowly developed over millennia. What remained was the bare, lake-studded terrain of the Canadian Shield that we see today. Any communities that lay in the way of this torrent were instantly wiped from existence. There was no advance notice, no chance to flee, only a towering surge of water and ice, racing faster than any runner, annihilating all before it. Yet the devastation extended far beyond. The immediate floodplain. All that colossal volume of fresh water needed a place to flow. A significant portion traveled southward via the Mississippi Valley, eventually reaching the Gulf of Mexico. However, at other times, different surges moved east through the Great Lakes and down the St. Lawrence River, or north into the Arctic Ocean. Each event dumped billions of gallons of melted glacial water into the sea in the blink of a geological eye, and this was only a single lake. All across the northern hemisphere, many more ice-dammed lakes were appearing, swelling, and then violently emptying. Every such lake was a disaster waiting to happen, and in the Pacific Northwest, an even more spectacular chain of floods was transforming the terrain. Glacial Lake Missoula, while not as large as Lake Agassiz, was situated such that its outbursts were exceptionally damaging. This lake took shape in present-day western Montana, held back by a tongue of the Cordilleran ice sheet that extended south from Canada into Idaho. As temperatures rose, the ice dam would eventually give way, unleashing the lake's waters in a catastrophic flood. Afterward, the ice would push forward once more, the lake would reform, and the entire process would start again. This cycle repeated no fewer than 40 times across 3 millennia. Every Missoula deluge unleashed roughly 500 cubic miles of water within just a few days. As the torrent was forced through tight mountain passages, its speed reached up to 60 miles per hour. Upon reaching the comparatively flat Columbia Basin in eastern Washington, the waters fanned out over 3,000 square miles. This created a vast, temporary inland sea, hundreds of feet deep, which then receded in under a week. The sheer force of these floods is almost beyond imagination. They carved gorges 1,000 feet deep into solid basalt. They also formed waterfalls 3 times taller than Niagara Falls, which lasted for only a few days before disappearing. These floods sculpted huge amphitheater-like valleys known as coulees, features so vast that the first geologists had no idea what could have created them. They also carried boulders the size of houses hundreds of miles from where they originated. What remained were strange, eroded formations called the channeled scablands, a landscape so distinctive it resembles an alien world. To any people who inhabited the area, each flood would have meant the end of their entire world. Picture the horizon, growing dark as a towering wall of water, 400 feet high, raced toward you at the speed of a galloping horse. This wall of water carried chunks of ice, massive rocks, and entire uprooted forests. There was no high ground to seek, no chance of outpacing it, no place to take refuge. Settlements that had thrived for generations would vanish in an instant, leaving behind only broken remnants, perhaps a handful of stone tools uncovered ages later in the flood sediments. Yet these spectacular outburst floods were merely one chapter of a much larger tale. They were devastating, but also short-lived. But the true change unfolded at a much slower pace, though with far greater permanence. Ocean levels were climbing as the great ice caps gradually melted, returning to the seas what had been. Locked away atop the continents for 100 millennia, this transformation was far from smooth or gradual. The speed at which the oceans rose shifted dramatically, depending on just how swiftly the ice was vanishing. Yet the overall direction was constant and impossible to halt. From 20,000 years ago up until 8,000 years ago, the world's seas climbed by roughly 400 feet. That's the height of a 40-story skyscraper straight upward. Saying 400 feet quickly doesn't sound like a huge number, but picture what it truly involved. Every low-lying coastline, every river and valley within hundreds of miles of the shore, every island or peninsula that wasn't tall and steep, all were swallowed by the waters. And the inundation didn't occur overnight. It crept in slowly, so that each generation might witness only a few feet of change, yet swift enough that within just a few human lifespans, the familiar landscape of youth became utterly alien. For the people enduring this era, it must have felt as if the world were ending in a drawn-out, agonizing crawl. The choicest hunting grounds, the finest fishing spots, and the most bountiful gathering places were always near coasts and rivers. Those very areas were the first to vanish beneath the waves. Over and over, families were forced to pull up stakes and move inland, abandoning settlements that had been home for generations, learning new ways to survive in less generous lands. Nowhere were these losses more stark than in places that simply disappeared as land entirely. Doggerland stands as one of prehistory's greatest lost realms. For most of the last ice age, the area that is now the North Sea, lying between Britain and mainland Europe, was solid, dry terrain. Not a barren, frozen wasteland, but a fertile and thriving landscape, river valleys, marshes, gentle hills, and thick forests. Clues from archaeology show it was likely among the most crowded regions in Mesolithic Europe. Doggerland lay at the very heart of Northern Europe's Ice Age world. Rivers that today flow separately into the North Sea, the Thames, the Rhine, the Seine, once merged together across Doggerland into a single mighty river system that emptied into the Atlantic far to the north. The shallow waters around it were probably immensely rich fishing grounds. The land itself sustained herds of aurochs, red deer, and wild horses. For the humans dwelling there, it was the prime spot to be. Then the ocean began its slow rise. At first, the changes barely caught anyone's notice. Coastal fishing zones edged a little farther inland. Where there had been uninterrupted land, islands started to appear. The outlets of rivers shifted their positions. But by 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was clearly shrinking. What once were rolling hills turned into separate islands. River valleys became narrow channels of water. Communities that had once been far from the coast found themselves crowded onto ever-narrowing shorelines. By 8,000 years ago, Doggerland existed only as a handful of large islands. Archaeological remains from this era reveal desperate efforts to adapt. People turned increasingly to the sea. These communities lived their daily lives, advancing their boat craftsmanship and devoting themselves to fishing and hunting sea mammals. Yet they were engaged in a fight they couldn't win against the encroaching waters. Approximately 6,200 years ago, Doggerland likely experienced its final disaster. Rock formations deep beneath the ocean point to a colossal submarine landslide near Norway's shore. This event, known as the Sturga Slide, set off a towering wave that would have brought ruin to any low-lying islands still above water. Any settlements that had somehow survived the steadily climbing sea levels would be wiped out in just hours. In the span of a few generations afterward, the final traces of Doggerland vanished forever under the water. What we now call Britain was fully separated as an island. The North Sea expanded to its present-day boundaries. A whole territory that had sheltered multitudes of humans for countless millennia now lay buried only in the ocean floor's layers. Our knowledge of Doggerland today comes solely from fishing trawlers that sometimes dredge up relics from locations that were once above water. Mammoth tusks, ancient stone implements, fragments of carved timber, these are clues to a forgotten realm. Similar events were unfolding all across the planet. Beringia, the expansive land bridge that linked Asia and North America throughout the Ice Age, was gradually being submerged. At its greatest size, Beringia spanned more than 1,000 miles from north to south, a vast plain that extended from Siberia all the way to Alaska. The first humans to settle the Americas had journeyed on foot across this terrain, tracking herds of mammoths and bison. With rising oceans, Beringia diminished, and the southern shorelines were the first to disappear, blocking the most convenient paths for travel. Afterwards, the heart of the landmass started to submerge, forming a sea within that later merged with the open ocean. Around 11,000 years back, just a slim corridor of land was left, and by 10,000 years ago, even that had vanished. The Bering Strait came into existence, severing the link between Asia and North America for the first time in 100 millennia. This development carried huge implications for the people dwelling on either side. Communities that had stayed connected for thousands of years now found themselves abruptly separated by 50 meters of seawater. The flow of genes and customs that had defined human societies across the Ice Age stopped suddenly. The inhabitants of the Americas and those of Asia started going their own ways, evolving distinct traits and cultures. All of this because the glaciers thawed and the oceans climbed. Yet there is perhaps no place where the human toll of higher waters could be more striking than the Black Sea. In modern times, the Black Sea is linked to the Mediterranean by the slim Bosphorus Strait. However, throughout much of the Ice Age, with ocean heights many hundreds of feet below current levels, the Black Sea was a separate lake filled with fresh water. The height of the Black Sea was determined by the rivers feeding it, and it stood roughly 500 feet beneath the Mediterranean's surface. As the world's oceans swelled from the thawing ice caps, the Mediterranean gradually rose. Approximately 7,600 years in the past, based on the Black Sea flood theory put forward by geologists Walter Pittman and William Ryan, the ascending Mediterranean eventually overflowed the natural dam at the Bosphorus. What followed was a deluge that may have given rise to some of the most ancient and lasting legends of humankind. Salt water started rushing into the deeper Black Sea basin, not little by little, but as a tremendous cascade that would outshine any waterfall seen today. Studies indicate that the torrent gushed through the gap at a volume 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, producing a thunderous noise audible across hundreds of miles. The height of the Black Sea increased by more than 6 inches daily. In the most level regions, the shoreline pushed forward by a mile or more every single day. Any settlements surrounding the Black Sea would have been utterly bewildered by the events. This was no ordinary seasonal inundation that would eventually withdraw. This was the great ocean itself, steadily taking back the land, moving forward without pause, day after day, week after week. Villages, farmlands, fishing stations, and hunting territories all sank under salty waves that destroyed the freshwater environments they relied upon. For at least a year, perhaps even several years, the floodwaters kept rising until the Black Sea eventually stabilized at its present-day level. During that period, more than 60,000 square miles of terrain, a region comparable to the state of Georgia, disappeared under the sea. Findings from archaeology in the area reveal that settlements were abruptly deserted around that era. Communities were moving away to neighboring lands. Certain scientists believe that the Black Sea flood was so overwhelming and unprecedented in human memory that it was woven into the legends of every surrounding civilization. The tale of Gilgamesh, the account of Noah from the Bible, and the Greek myth of Deucalion's flood are all stories of a great deluge. Perhaps they are ancient echoes of that fateful moment when the ocean burst through and submerged the land. Regardless of whether the flood theory holds true in all specifics, the larger truth remains certain. Across the globe, people living by the coasts were suffering steady, devastating losses of their territory to the advancing waters. This was quite different from today's sea level changes, which we track in tiny increments each year. During the late glacial period, the ocean's advance was so rapid that a person could witness it over the course of their own life. Picture yourself as a young one, playing along the shore and catching fish in tidal rivers that were just a short stroll from your home. Come your middle years, those same beaches now lie half a day's journey inland, and the familiar camping spots rest beneath the waves. When your grandchildren arrive, the landscapes of your youth survive only in memory and tales. This same pattern recurred again and again across many millennia. Every new generation had to adjust to an ever-dwindling world. The emotional toll would have been immense. Any civilization that endured through that era would have crafted legends of a great flood, tales of when the seas swelled and the former world was swallowed. These were not mere imagination or spiritual metaphors. They were the recollections of a people. Preserved in narrative, these were real occurrences that molded human history. Yet the inundations and advancing oceans did more than uproot communities and submerge lands. They transformed the planet's climate in fundamental ways, setting off a last great upheaval before the Ice Age finally loosened its hold. The massive influx of meltwater into the seas did not simply lift the ocean's height, it was also reshaping the currents of the ocean, especially in the North Atlantic, where the waters move in a vast, circulating system, akin to a giant conveyor belt. Warm waters travel northward from the tropics, carrying warmth to the northern regions of Europe. Once they arrive near the Arctic, they cool down, grow heavier, and descend, then go back southward as a deep-flowing stream. This mechanism, known as the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, is what makes northern Europe far milder than it would naturally be. However, it relies on saline water. Because fresh water is lighter than salt water, it does not sink as readily. When enormous quantities of fresh meltwater from Lake Agassiz and other glacial lakes surged into the North Atlantic, this formed a layer of fresh water that interfered with the whole circulation pattern. The great conveyor began to slow. Certain scientists suggest that it might have come to a complete halt for a time. This led to an environmental catastrophe known as the Younger Dryas. Approximately 12,900 years ago, when the planet was heating up and the glaciers were withdrawing, the northern hemisphere abruptly experienced a drop in temperature, reverting almost to Ice Age levels. The ice sheets, which had been melting, started to grow and advance once more. Tundra took over the forests that had begun to regrow in areas once covered by ice. The pattern of warming that had characterized the preceding 2 millennia reversed itself within just 10 years. This was not merely a localized cold spell. Instead, it marked a return to Ice Age conditions that persisted for 2 centuries. This occurred because the melting ice interfered with the same climate systems that were bringing the Ice Age to a close. The Earth became trapped in a feedback cycle. Warming led to melting led to cooling slowed the melting, and eventually, warming could start again. The climate staggered unpredictably from one state to another, like someone intoxicated, never settling into balance for the people living through it. The Younger Dryas period proved utterly destructive. Communities that had adjusted to warmer times moved into newly available lands and pursued herds of animals heading northward. Abruptly, they saw their food vanish and the chill return. Digs reveal that many settlements were deserted and population numbers plummeted throughout this era. Certain scholars believe the pressures of the Younger Dryas might have been the last straw. This forced people in the Fertile Crescent to invent farming. Once you can no longer depend on what nature provides, you must begin cultivating your own sustenance. Approximately 11,700 years in the past, the Younger Dryas concluded as suddenly as it started. The surges of meltwater that had thrown ocean currents into disarray eventually ceased. The great ocean conveyor belt kicked back into action. Temperatures soared upward once more, rising even more rapidly than they had fallen. The glaciers commenced their ultimate withdrawal. The drawn-out, volatile shift away from the Ice Age had at last concluded, yet the harm had already occurred. Whole regions had been remolded. Shorelines had shifted hundreds of miles inward. Waterways and lakes had been entirely restructured. People had been driven out, relocated, and compelled to change in just 5 millennia more dramatically than in the preceding 50,000 years. The planet that surfaced from the deluges and swelling oceans was completely altered. Mankind, once again challenged by disastrous shifts in the environment, had discovered another path to endure. However, enduring always demands a price, and the price of outlasting the Great Thaw would influence human society in methods we continue to uncover even now. Somewhere in the span, from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, an event without precedent occurred on our planet. It wasn't the impact of a meteor, the eruption of a supervolcano, or even an abrupt climate disaster in the usual meaning. Rather, it was something subtler, yet eventually more ruinous. The Earth bid farewell to its colossal creatures. We refer to a mass extinction that eliminated nearly 178 varieties of sizable mammals. These animals had ruled their habitats for hundreds of thousands, in some cases, millions of years. Woolly mammoths that had weathered multiple glacial eras, mastodons that had roamed North America since the Maya period, enormous ground sloths the size of elephants, saber-toothed cats that had honed the art of ambush predation across thousands of years, cave lions bigger than any modern big cat, dire wolves, massive beavers as large as bears, and short-faced bears that could reach 12 feet when standing upright. Every one vanished, not slowly over millions of years, which is the typical pace of extinction. Instead, it happened in a geological instant 5,000 years, which is mere seconds in evolutionary terms. That's only about 200 human lifetimes. To truly grasp the scale of the disaster, you have to picture the world as it was before these creatures started disappearing. At the peak of the last ice age, massive animals weighing more than 100 pounds ruled every landmass except Antarctica. Just in North America, there were more than 50 different kinds of giant mammals. Woolly mammoths and mastodons grazed together in mixed groups. 3 separate types of ground sloths had evolved to fill different environmental roles. 2 kinds of saber-toothed cats vied with dire wolves, alongside American lions and short-faced bears, all hunting the same prey. Glyptodonts, which were armored creatures resembling Volkswagen Beetles with tails, roamed alongside giant camels, prehistoric horses, and enormous bison that dwarfed today's buffalo. But South America was even more incredible. This continent had spent millions of years in isolation, giving rise to a wholly unique collection of giant animals. Among them were ground sloths that could weigh up to 8,000 pounds. Toxodon were creatures similar to rhinos but with the bulk of hippos and teeth like rodents. Macrauchenia were odd mammals, sporting trunks like elephants and bodies shaped like camels. Marsupial saber-tooths developed their hunting ways entirely separately from the placental predators up north. Meanwhile, terror birds stood 10 feet tall, were flightless, and had beaks strong enough to shatter bone. Eurasia was home to its own set of titans. Woolly rhinoceroses roamed from Spain all the way to Siberia. Cave bears slept through the winters in enormous caverns. Megaloceros, also called the Irish elk, carried antlers that stretched 12 feet across. Steppe bison, European lions, and all those iconic large animals we picture in Ice Age cave art were living in such robust numbers they appeared unbeatable. Yet Australia's giant creatures were probably the most unusual of them all. Diprotodon holds the record as the biggest marsupial ever, a relative of the wombat that weighed 3 tons. Huge kangaroos reached 10 feet in height but were unable to hop. Megalania was a terrestrial monitor lizard that grew to 20 feet in length. Marsupial lions possessed retractable claws on their thumbs, perfect for tearing meat. Thunderbirds were enormous, flightless birds with formidable beaks, but then the ice sheets began to melt and everything shifted. In just 5,000 years, 3/4 of North America's large mammal types had vanished. South America lost 80%, and Australia, which had begun to lose species even earlier, lost roughly 70%. Even Eurasia, which held up better than many places, saw about half of its big mammal species disappear. The question that has captivated researchers for more than 100 years is easy to pose but incredibly tough to resolve. So why did this happen? The most straightforward explanation, and one that still seems obvious, is climate change. The close of the Ice Age involved more than melting ice. Rising oceans and retreating glaciers completely reshaped ecosystems across the entire globe. Environments that had remained unchanged for tens of millennia vanished within just a few hundred years. The mammoth steppe, a sprawling grassland that extended from Spain to Canada, covering more territory than any modern biome, was gone. As temperatures climbed and rainfall patterns changed, the special mix of grasses, herbs, and shrubs that fed mammoth herds could no longer thrive. This was not merely warming, it was habitat change on the scale of entire continents. After the mammoth steppe disappeared, it was replaced by birch forests, wetlands, and tundra, all of which offered far less nutrition for large grazing animals. A mammoth needed to consume around 400 pounds of plants each day, and the original steppe grasses were rich enough in nutrients to sustain that huge appetite. The new vegetation couldn't match that nutritional value, and this same pattern repeated across different ecosystems. In North America, the spruce forests that once covered the interior during ice ages gradually gave way to deciduous hardwoods. Mastodons, who were specialized browsers that fed on spruce and pine, suddenly saw their preferred food disappearing. The mosaic of grasslands and parklands that had supported a variety of grazing herds broke apart into smaller and smaller patches. These small patches were separated by dense forests that large animals couldn't easily cross. In northern Europe, the open tundra steppe had once supported mammoths and woolly rhinos. Populations of rhinos and reindeer were replaced by thick northern forests. These woods provided cover for smaller prey like deer and elk, but they couldn't sustain the massive herds of mega-herbivores that had thrived in the open country. Yet, here's an interesting thought. Those giant animals had survived climate changes before. The Pleistocene was characterized by repeated glacial cycles. Roughly every 100,000 years, ice sheets would advance and retreat. Temperatures swung wildly. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet, and ecosystems transformed repeatedly. Still, the megafauna made it through all those previous transitions. Mammoths, for instance, had survived at least 4 full glacial cycles before finally going extinct. So what made this particular warming event so deadly? That question led scientists to a second major theory. Humans were involved. It wasn't climate change itself, but rather hunting pressure from an increasingly sophisticated and rapidly expanding population of Homo sapiens that drove the extinction. This hypothesis, sometimes called the overkill theory, argues that human hunters, not environmental change, caused the extinction wave. The evidence for human involvement is compelling. First, look at the timing. The extinction wave doesn't align perfectly with climate change. It aligns with human arrival. In Australia, large animals started disappearing around 45,000 years ago, shortly after humans first colonized the continent. In North America, the extinction rate accelerated dramatically between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, right when the Clovis people appeared. These skilled hunters were spreading across the continent. In Madagascar, giant lemurs and elephant birds survived until just 2,000 years ago. They vanished within a few centuries of humans arriving. New Zealand's moa, massive, flightless birds, lasted until 1300 CE. Then, Polynesian settlers arrived, and within 200 years, all moa species were extinct. This pattern of extinction shortly after humans arrive shows up again and again. Continental islands like Cyprus lost their dwarf, hippos, and elephants soon after humans settled there. Remote Pacific islands lost dozens of bird species when Polynesian voyagers reached them. The Caribbean also lost its unique ground sloths when humans colonized those islands. Archaeological evidence supports this connection. Clovis kill sites in North America reveal sophisticated hunting strategies. They set up drive lines to channel mammoths into swamps or box canyons and ambush them at river crossings. There's evidence of systematic butchering, where hunters took the best cuts and left the rest. This wasn't just opportunistic scavenging. Chemical analysis of Clovis points shows they were specifically engineered for penetrating thick hide. The fluting those distinctive grooves running up the center of Clovis spear points reduced weight while maintaining strength, creating projectiles that could be thrown with deadly accuracy at large, dangerous prey. Human hunting technology was improving rapidly during this period. Spear throwers, or atlatls, could launch projectiles with 3 times the force of hand-thrown spears. Composite weapons combining different materials were used for optimal performance. Using coordinated group hunting strategies, small human bands could bring down creatures much larger than themselves. Modern computer simulations of ancient hunting methods back up the overkill theory. The simulations indicate that even a low level of hunting pressure, just 1 large animal killed per person each year, could wipe out populations of big mammals within a few hundred years. This effect is most pronounced for species that reproduce slowly. For instance, mammoths didn't become sexually mature until about 15 years old, and their pregnancies lasted 22 months. A mammoth might only give birth to 5 or 6 young over its entire life, so you wouldn't have to kill many of them to stop the population from bouncing back. But it wasn't only direct hunting that caused trouble. The ways humans changed the landscape also made life tougher for the giant creatures. Native peoples throughout the Americas, Australia, and elsewhere employed fire to manage the land. Through regular burning, they created a patchwork of different plant communities, which benefited some game species but made it harder for others. These ecosystems, shaped by human activity, may have been less friendly to large animals that had adapted to different kinds of habitats. Yet the argument over whether climate or humans was the main cause isn't really an either-or question. A third explanation, and the one that most researchers now support, is that it was a combination of both, a perfect storm where climate change. Climatic stress made large animal populations vulnerable, and then human hunting delivered the final blow. Individually, neither factor would have been enough, but together they proved catastrophic. Imagine seeing the world through a mammoth's eyes. You're facing fast-changing patterns of plant life. The grasses you once relied on are vanishing, replaced by plants with less nutritional value. Your herd is feeling the strain. Birth rates are falling, and fewer calves survive to adulthood. Then people show up. At first, not many, just a handful of bands, expert hunters who have spent thousands of years honing their skills at taking down big, dangerous animals. In ordinary times, your herd could handle losing a few individuals to hunters. But these are far from ordinary times. You're already battling food shortages caused by the changing climate. Every mammoth that gets killed by hunters is one that won't reproduce or help rear the next generation. This deadly combination seals the fate of the species. Within a few hundred years, the herds break apart, then crash, and finally vanish completely. This perfect storm hypothesis clears up several mysteries about the extinction event. It accounts for why the disappearances are linked both to climate shifts and to the arrival of humans. Both factors had to be present. It also explains why certain areas saw greater losses of species than others. The extent of the extinction depended on how severe the climate change was and how actively people hunted. The theory also explains why smaller creatures mostly made it through while the megafauna died out. Smaller animals breed more rapidly, so their populations can bounce back faster from hunting. When you examine the patterns of extinction on different continents, this two-pressure hypothesis becomes even more convincing. In Africa and certain regions of Asia, where humans and megafauna shared a long coevolutionary history spanning millions of years, the loss of species was minimal. Animals like African elephants, rhinos, hippos, and giraffes managed to survive, even though they had always coexisted with human hunters. These creatures developed behaviors that made them challenging to hunt. They were wary of humans, quick to flee, and possessed dangerous defensive tactics. However, in the Americas, Australia, and isolated islands, where megafauna had their first encounters with humans, the extinctions were devastating. These animals had never evolved alongside human hunters. They lacked any innate fear or defensive reactions, specifically tailored to the danger posed by bipedal predators armed with long-range weapons. Imagine a mammoth that had endured attacks from saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears. It would stand firm, using its tusks for defense, trying to confront human hunters in the same manner. That was a fatal error. Humans could strike from afar with coordinated strategies that no predator had ever used before. The naive prey hypothesis sheds light on why extinctions happen so quickly in areas where humans were new arrivals. Animals simply did not see humans as a danger. They were easy to hunt, and before defensive behaviors could develop through natural selection, their populations were already collapsing. Yet these extinctions were not merely about losing single species. They set off chain reactions that reshaped entire ecosystems and landscapes. Megafauna were more than just large creatures. They were engineers of their ecosystems, whose existence fundamentally influenced their surroundings. Take mammoths, for example. One herd could devour 10 tons of plants each day, but they did more than eat. They trimmed, trampled, and enriched the soil. By pushing over young trees, mammoths prevented forests from overtaking grasslands, and they dispersed seeds through their droppings, occasionally carrying them hundreds of kilometers. Their grazing habits produced a mosaic of varied habitats that sustained numerous other life forms. With the mammoths gone, these ecological functions also disappeared. Without large plant eaters to keep trees in check, the mammoth steppe gave way to forests and tundra. Species that thrived in open plains suddenly lost their homes. This once rich and diverse ecosystem, which had fostered some of the most abundant communities in Earth's history, crumbled into simpler, less varied systems. In South America, ground sloths performed similar functions. Colossal species dug out vast cave networks with their burrowing activities. Numerous other creatures took shelter in these caves. Ground sloths were also crucial seed dispersers. They spread the seeds of particular tree species. Certain plants, such as the avocado, developed sizable fruits precisely to be consumed and dispersed by megafauna. Once the ground sloths vanished, these plants lost their main seed dispersers. Nowadays, avocados and several other trees with large fruits are regarded as evolutionary anachronisms. These plants continue to bear fruit for creatures that are long gone. In North American forests, mastodons created and sustained clearings in thick woods, producing a patchwork of habitats that supported a wide variety of plants and animals. In the absence of mastodons, forests grew thicker and more monotonous, becoming less hospitable for species requiring diverse environments. The loss of megafaunal predators also had deep impacts. Saber-toothed cats and other big meat-eaters had controlled the numbers of plant-eaters. When these apex predators vanished, the surviving herbivores faced less threat from being hunted, but that wasn't always beneficial. Without predators culling the weak and diseased, illnesses spread more easily among herbivore herds. Patterns of fire also shifted. Megafauna grazing had kept the amount of combustible material low in many environments. Once these large grazers were gone, dead plant matter built up. Some scientists believe this led to more frequent fires in some areas, further altering landscapes. Even the cycling of nutrients changed. The carcasses of giant creatures were vast reservoirs of essential nutrients. Whenever these animals perished, by natural death or being hunted, these nutrients were spread over the land. Predators transported them from where they killed to faraway lairs. Scavengers carried them even farther. The disappearance of megafauna reduced nutrient movement, possibly making soils poorer in certain areas. Yet a number of species managed to endure. Figuring out the reasons gives us crucial insights into how life bounces back from extinction threats. These survivors possess traits that were absent in those that vanished. One key trait was reproductive adaptability. For instance, deer, elk, and caribou modify how often they breed depending on the environment. In abundant times, they give birth to more young. During lean seasons, they reduce breeding. In contrast, the giant mammals with fixed, unhurried reproductive patterns were unable to adapt similarly. Another factor was broad diet preferences. Bison thrived in North America, partly due to their ability to consume many different plant types, unlike pickier herbivores. When their favored meals became scarce, bison simply turned to other food sources. Specialists, such as mammoths and mastodons, found themselves with limited alternatives. Flexible behavior also played a part. Animals that rapidly changed their ways when faced with fresh dangers stood a stronger chance of surviving. Elk and deer picked up tactics to steer clear of human predators. In regions with intense hunting, they switched to being active at night. They grew extremely wary whenever humans were near. Additionally, having a smaller physical frame proved beneficial. Across nearly all animal families, the tinier species fared better than their bigger cousins. Having a large body, size, once a benefit in the steady Ice Age environment, turned into a disadvantage. Big creatures required larger food supplies, took longer to reproduce, and were more tempting prey for hunters. Living in a range of habitats was another advantage. Animals that did well in various landscapes could find safe havens when their usual homes changed. Those specialized to specific habitat setups had no escape routes once those environments were gone. These survival traits were not spread uniformly around the world, which helps account for why extinction hit some regions harder than others. Africa, where humans and megafauna had coexisted for a very long time, had naturally favored many of these characteristics over countless millennia. The giant animals of the Americas and Australia, meeting advanced human hunters for the first time, simply did not have those evolutionary adaptations. The insights from this long-ago wave of extinction still carry great weight in our current era. Today we are experiencing yet another era of swift climate shifts and growing human influence. This is the sixth mass extinction, according to conservation biologists, and it is already happening. Scientists calculate that species are now vanishing at a rate 100 to 1,000 times faster than the normal historical pace. The similarities to the past are impossible to ignore. Just as it was 12,000 years ago, climate-altered habitats are changing faster than numerous species can keep up with. Similarly, human actions ruining natural environments, hunting, contaminating the planet, are piling on extra pressures that lead to extinction. Pressure mounts on those already fragile groups. And similar to that time, we're learning that together, these stresses cause far greater harm than any single one could. From the megafauna die-offs, we learned that creatures who appear unbreakable, having thrived across millions of years and many climate shifts, may suddenly crumble once they've exceeded what they can adapt to. They revealed that removing a crucial species sends ripple effects across the entire ecosystem, transformations that can last millennia. They also showed that prey with no evolutionary memory of certain dangers are particularly exposed. Modern endangered species, trapped in ever smaller homes and facing new challenges such as a warming planet, broken landscapes, and fresh illnesses, may be just as unprepared. They lack the evolved reflexes to cope. Yet a key distinction separates that era from ours. The people who played a part in wiping out giant creatures 12 millennia ago had no idea of their actions' consequences. They had no way to foresee that their pursuit of game could erase entire kinds of animals, nor that those disappearances would reshape the world around them. Their only aim was to feed themselves. That excuse is not available to us. We are aware of what our deeds lead to. We witness species vanish before our eyes as they occur. We possess the understanding and maybe the means to stop more from being lost. The real issue is if we will use what we've learned before we say goodbye to the elephants, rhinos, and other present-day giants, the final remnants of a planet once filled with enormous beings. The great die-off that spread across the Earth 12,000 years ago was not unavoidable. Rather, it came from a combination of clear, comprehensible forces that coincided at a specific point in time. These days, we are arranging comparable convergences, and fast-moving climate shifts together with heavy human impact add up to danger of extinction. The contrast is that now we have a say in how the tale concludes. Glaciers were retreating, and as they did, the realm that humans had inhabited for 100 millennia was fading away. To the hunters of the Ice Age, the end did not appear as one sudden disaster. Instead, it arrived like a gradual breakdown of all that their forebears had refined across countless generations. The woolly mammoths were vanishing. The massive herds of bison were getting smaller. Caribou that had moved along the same routes for thousands of years were altering their pathways, pursuing plant growth that had become unpredictable. Picture yourself as a member of a hunting group some 14,000 years ago. Your great-great-grandfather once stalked mammoths through these same valleys. The skills had traveled across hundreds of lineages. You understood precisely where the animals gathered every season. You knew exactly which mountain gaps they would cross on their journeys. You had practiced the art of the hunt ever since you could grip a spear. But then, abruptly, within a mere handful of generations, the mammoths had disappeared, not solely from overhunting, although that played a role, but because the very terrain was changing. The chilly steppes where they flourished were turning into woodlands. The few groups that remained were reduced in number, spread far apart, and much harder to anticipate. This was a threat to their very existence. For 100,000 years, people stood at the top of the food chain, experts at taking down giant beasts. These huge animals gave them all they needed: flesh, fat, skins for clothes and homes, bones to craft tools, tendons for fastening. One mammoth alone could sustain a group of 50 for many weeks. Losing the chance to hunt such creatures was far more than a minor trouble. The very foundation of Ice Age survival methods was under threat. Yet people didn't go hungry. Instead, they did exactly what the population bottleneck had prepared them to do. They adapted. The archaeological evidence from this era reveals something astonishing: a sudden burst in food variety. Sites that once held nearly only large mammal bones now show signs of fishing, bird hunting, shellfish gathering, and heavy plant processing. This wasn't a slow, gradual change. It occurred quickly, within just a few centuries at most, a mere instant in evolutionary terms. Let's explore what truly shifted. First, fishing became organized and advanced. During the Ice Age, humans occasionally fished, but it wasn't a staple food source. Too much effort for too little reward when you could hunt instead. Megafauna took its place. But as the ice melted and sea levels rose, coastal landscapes changed dramatically. Estuaries appeared where rivers met the encroaching ocean. These brackish mixing zones turned into extremely productive habitats, full of fish, shellfish, and waterfowl. Humans responded by creating fishing tools that their Ice Age ancestors could never have imagined. Intricate fish traps woven from reeds could be set in rivers and checked every day. Bonefish hooks came in dozens of specialized shapes, each optimized for a different type of fish. Harpoons featured detachable heads and line attachments for catching large fish and marine mammals. Nets woven from plant fibers allowed entire communities to harvest massive amounts of fish at once. Shell middens, enormous piles of discarded shellfish remains, began appearing at coastal sites around this time. Some of these middens are gigantic, hundreds of feet long and dozens of feet deep, representing millennia of continuous shellfish gathering. This reveals something deep. Humans didn't just rely on shellfish as a backup during hard times. They made it a dietary staple, a reliable food source available year-round with little risk. The Ertebelle culture in Scandinavia is a perfect example. About 12,000 years ago, as forests replaced tundra, these coastal people built an entire lifestyle around marine resources. Their sites show systematic use of oysters, mussels, fish, seals, and waterfowl. They developed specialized tools for every task: oyster knives, fish scalers, bird snares, seal harpoons. They weren't primitive scavengers, just making do with whatever they found. They were sophisticated marine resource managers with deep knowledge of seasonal patterns and sustainable harvesting methods. But the most crucial change was happening with plants. For millions of years, human ancestors were mainly meat eaters. Plants were a side dish, something consumed when meat wasn't available. The Ice Age had reinforced this pattern. Cold climates meant fewer edible plants, and those that existed were often low in calories and hard to process. The warming changed everything. As temperatures rose and rainfall increased, grasslands exploded with new growth. The ancestors of wheat and barley wild grasses that had once existed in small, scattered patches suddenly had perfect conditions. They spread rapidly across the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria to the eastern Mediterranean. Though packed with nutrients, these wild grains were tricky to gather. As they matured, their seeds broke off effortlessly and fell to the earth, making collection a real challenge. The grains were tiny and demanded a lot of work. They had to be ground to peel away their hard outer shells before they became edible. Yet early people found a way, evidence from ancient digs. Dating back roughly 13,000 years, we find the earliest organized grain gathering: flint sickle blades, polished from slicing plant stalks, and grinding stones, smoothed by countless cycles of seed processing. Clay-lined pits allowed stored grain to stay dry all winter long. That changed everything. Never before had humans been able to set aside so many calories for future needs. One bountiful harvest could sustain them for several months. The basic arithmetic of survival shifted entirely. There was no longer any need to endlessly track wild herds. Now you could settle down for a portion of the year, relying on your grain reserves. Still, early grain collection presented a dilemma. Wild wheat and barley naturally evolved to scatter their seeds, which made harvesting them an exercise in frustration. You had to time your harvest perfectly, neither too early when the seeds were still unripe, nor too late after they'd already dispersed. Then came a discovery that would redirect the entire path of civilization. Certain wheat plants possessed a genetic quirk. Their seeds clung to the stalk at maturity instead of falling off. In nature, these mutants were at a disadvantage because their seeds couldn't spread. For people gathering grain, however, these plants were ideal, by deliberately picking the non-shattering ones and then scattering their seeds. Around their camps for the following season, they had unwittingly launched the first domestication project on Earth. Within a few millennia, the wheat around human homes had transformed beyond recognition compared to its wild cousins. Bigger grains, stems that held their seeds, and sturdier stalks that could withstand the wind. Humans had crafted a new species, one entirely dependent on their care. This process unfolded independently elsewhere. Barley in the Middle East, rice in China, and maize in Mexico. By 10,000 years back, Communities across several parts of the world had mastered farming. No longer mere gatherers of nature's bounty, they now actively managed crops, chose plants with favorable characteristics, and shaped the land to suit their requirements. Agriculture wasn't born of a single stroke of genius. It arose out of sheer need, as traditional food supplies dwindled and groups had no other options. Yet once it took hold, it set off a chain of consequences that no one foresaw. The most direct effect was a sedentary lifestyle. As foragers and hunters, mobility was essential. Edible resources were spread out over wide areas. They moved with the seasons, traveling to wherever food was plentiful. Groups of 30 to 50 individuals struck the right balance, nimble enough to relocate swiftly, yet sizable enough to hunt and protect themselves. Farming, however, upset that balance. Once crops are sown, you must remain in place to guard them from animals, to irrigate them when. Harvesting had to happen at just the perfect moment, and storing grain demanded fixed buildings. Grinding the grain needed heavy stones that couldn't easily be moved. The earliest fixed communities emerged roughly 12,000 years ago, not true cities, but small villages. These were groups of round or oval homes built from rock, clay, brick, and wood, with each dwelling sheltering one extended family. Villages held between 50 and 200 inhabitants, much bigger than the old hunter-gatherer groups. The finest early model is Jericho in the Jordan Valley. Some 11,000 years back, that settlement had maybe 70 homes, housing around 300 to 400 individuals. They cultivated wheat and barley that had been domesticated, yet they still chased wild gazelles and collected wild plants. This was not yet complete farming. It was a shift, a blend of cultivating crops and old-style food collection. But Jericho featured something never seen before: walls, enormous stone defenses with towers climbing 20 feet high. Constructing these would have taken thousands of human hours of organized work. This reveals a deep truth. The village was valuable enough to protect, and folks had put so much into their fields, homes, and storage that they couldn't just walk away when danger came. It also shows that dangers were real. Walls don't appear for no reason. They are created as a reaction to conflict. When the richest farming lands drew in bigger settled populations, rivalry grew stronger. Communities that used to just dodge each other by roaming to separate territories now ended up battling over particular spots that were hard to substitute. Çatalhöyük in today's Turkey illustrates where this path took them. Around 9,000 years in the past, this town held maybe 8,000 residents, ranking it among humanity's earliest genuine cities. Its design was remarkable. Dwellings were packed side by side without any streets, reachable only by ladders through holes in the roofs. The whole community was basically a single, unbroken building. Inside those homes, we witnessed the complete rise of farming society. Containers packed with grain, grinding stones hollowed out by countless hours of work, and advanced ovens for making bread. Their tool collections held sickles, hoes, grain processing gear, and cooking utensils that were much more varied than any tools from the Ice Age. Yet we also notice another thing. Differences emerged. Certain homes were bigger and more skillfully built. A few graves held precious items from trade obsidian from faraway places, Mediterranean seashells, and copper decorations. Other tombs had only the corpse. Society was splitting into layers. Rank systems were forming. This did not happen by chance. Farming produced something new, a never-before-seen surplus that could be stored. Back in the Ice Age, you could only eat what you could carry or eat right away. There was no real method to build up riches, and everyone in a group had about the same physical belongings, but thanks to grain storage, certain families could gather more than their neighbors. Perhaps they owned richer soil, labored more intensely, or were fortunate with the weather. No matter the cause, inequality became achievable, and once achievable, it grew unavoidable. A few individuals started to focus on specific tasks. If you could swap saved grain for different items, you no longer needed to farm personally. Early farming villages reveal experts in crafts, potters, toolmakers, builders, and merchants. Each person concentrated on their own skill and exchanged their items for food grown by others. This focus on specialties pushed technological progress forward at a rate never seen before. Take pottery. In the Ice Age, people sometimes created rough-fired clay pieces, but pottery, as an organized technique, did not yet exist. For people on the move, pottery wasn't a good fit. Clay containers are both heavy and breakable, making them hard to carry around. However, once communities settled down to farm, the invention of pottery truly changed everything. With sealed clay pots, grain could be kept safe from dampness and insects, and you could prepare hearty stews and porridges that were easier on the stomach. Fermentation also became possible, opening up new tastes and ways to keep food from spoiling. Around 10,000 years back, advanced pottery traditions had appeared in farming areas, each boasting its own unique shapes and ornamental designs. Stone tools were also undergoing a major change, the era of chipped stone. For millions of years, chipped stone tools reigned supreme. But now polished versions started taking over axes that could chop down trees with ease, adzes for carving wood, and grinding stones to process grain. Making these polished tools required much more time than the simple flaked ones, but they lasted longer and worked better. Since people no longer had to relocate every few weeks, they could spend weeks crafting a single, perfect stone axe. Likely around this time, the bow and arrow were invented. This era brought a revolution in hunting. For hundreds of thousands of years, spears were humankind's go-to weapon for the hunt, but they had limited range and demanded a lot of strength. With bows and arrows, hunters could bring down prey from far away, using much less effort. A skilled bowman could take birds and small mammals that would have been almost impossible to hunt with spears. However, the truly groundbreaking technological advance was something that leaves only faint traces in the archaeological evidence: the domestication of plants and animals. These early farmers had real expertise, running complex breeding programs that spanned generations. They carefully watched which plants yielded the most seeds, which grew the quickest, and which showed the strongest resistance to disease. They chose breeding stock using elaborate criteria, developing varieties best suited to human requirements. A similar process unfolded with animals. Dogs were already domesticated during the Ice Age, likely as hunting partners and camp guardians. But once the ice sheets retreated, humans started domesticating sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. By 10,000 years ago, a mixed system of growing crops and raising livestock was well established throughout the Fertile Crescent. Tamed animals offered numerous advantages: meat, milk, wool, leather, and the muscle to pull plows and carry loads. Animals were like living warehouses, turning plants that people couldn't digest into usable food and fuel, all while reproducing on their own. This combination gave rise to something never seen before: a population boom. For hunter-gatherers, population size was held back by how much food was around and the need to keep moving. Women in nomadic groups usually had children about 4 years apart, since it was too hard to carry more than one small child while traveling. The population grew slowly, at roughly 0.1% each year. Farming communities, though, were able to sustain bigger families. Living in one place allowed women to give birth more often. Porridges made from grains made it simpler to wean babies. With a steadier food supply, more children lived to become adults. Farming populations expanded at about 0.1% per year, 100 times quicker than hunter-gatherer groups. That might not seem like a big number, but compounding growth is incredibly powerful. With a 0.1% yearly increase, the population doubles every 7 centuries. Over just a few millennia, farming populations came to far outnumber the dwindling bands of hunter-gatherers. By 8,000 years ago, most people in the Middle East, as well as in parts of China and the Americas, were farmers. Yet the growing population brought fresh challenges. The most fertile farmland was soon taken, and families had to search for new plots for their children, fueling further expansion. Agricultural villages moved out from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, North Africa, and Central Asia. Meanwhile, other independent farming hubs in China, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Americas experienced similar growth. This spread frequently pushed aside the hunter-gatherers who still lived there. When settlers ventured into new lands, they didn't only introduce farming, they also brought illnesses. Crowded, permanent communities coexisting closely with livestock created perfect conditions for contagious outbreaks like measles, smallpox, tuberculosis, and other diseases. These sicknesses devastated hunter-gatherer groups who lacked any natural defense, and findings from European archaeology clearly illustrate this pattern. As agriculturalists from the Middle East spread into Europe around 9,000 years ago, the genetic traces of native European hunter-gatherers mostly vanished. They were either replaced, outdone, or assimilated by the farming communities. And this same situation occurred all over the world wherever agriculturalists encountered foraging peoples. Yet, the spread of farming also fostered more intricate social structures. Coordinating irrigation methods demanded cooperation across numerous households, and protecting stored crops from raiders called for organized armed groups. Settling disagreements over land possession needed leaders and regulations, and simple equal bands transformed into tribes, then into chiefdoms, and eventually into early states. Around 7,000 years ago, the first genuine civilizations began to appear. Sumerian Mesopotamia arose with cities comprising tens of thousands of inhabitants, writing systems for keeping records, dedicated administrative bodies, grand buildings, and elaborate religious systems. All this had evolved in merely 5,000 years, from the initial permanent villages to urban civilizations. But prior to cities and writing, ahead of kings and sacred places, there existed something different. There was a cultural outburst, suggesting that the intellectual shift during this era was just as significant as the economic one. Göbekli Tepe in present-day Turkey offers the most impressive proof. This location features enormous stone circles with intricately engraved pillars depicting animals, abstract signs, and geometric shapes. Each of these stones can weigh up to 20 tons. Shifting and engraving them would have required the coordinated effort of hundreds. Here's what makes it so remarkable. It was constructed 11,500 years ago, before farming had become common in that area. Those who built it were still largely hunter-gatherers. They erected a monumental ceremonial place before they built lasting homes. They dedicated effort to crafting holy ground before they fully dedicated themselves to agriculture. This reveals something deep. The change was not solely about economics or society. It was about technology, cognition, and spirituality. People were creating fresh ways to understand the universe, their role within it, their connections, and forces beyond human management. The artwork from this period grows remarkably more refined and abundant. Ice Age cave paintings existed, but the art after the glaciers is distinct. Post-glacial art is more symbolic, more abstract, and more obviously intertwined with faith. Figurines are highly stylized depictions of people and animals. Elaborate graves point to sophisticated ideas about death and what comes after. Ceremonial areas indicate organized religions with dedicated leaders. Archaeologists have uncovered proof of large gatherings for eating at numerous early farming sites. It wasn't simply feeding. It was ritualized food consumption in social settings. These gatherings likely served many purposes. They strengthened community ties, showed off riches and standing, created duties and partnerships. They were the social bond that enabled large groups to operate without the family connections that had organized Ice Age clans. Connections for trade grew enormously. Obsidian, a volcanic stone prized for crafting sharp blades, was transported hundreds of miles from its sources to agricultural villages. Mediterranean seashells turn up at inland locations. Copper decorations appear long before copper toolmaking became efficient. But these traded items weren't only economically important. They were also status symbols, indicators of links to far-off areas and peoples. All of this, the farming, the villages, the growing social intricacy, the artistic bloom happened because the ice melted, because the mammoths vanished, and humans had to adapt or disappear, because a climate disaster wiped out the world they had known and pushed them to invent something completely novel. The irony is almost overwhelming. The most severe climate catastrophe in human history since the population bottleneck. The very catastrophe that erased the giant creatures and reshaped the Earth's terrain worldwide was the same force that sparked the dawn of human society. Had the ice remained frozen, had the woolly mammoths continued to roam, people would likely have stayed as tiny groups of nomadic hunters, trailing animals across vast, barren plains. But that very disaster compelled a level of creativity never before seen among humans. In just 5 millennia, people evolved from glacier-era nomads into farming hamlets, and ultimately into city inhabitants of the earliest advanced societies. The thawing glaciers laid the groundwork for farming. Farming, in turn, produced an abundance of food. Abundance gave rise to permanent communities, division of labor, intricate social structures, and new inventions. By 5,000 years ago, our ancestors were already constructing stone monuments that remain standing to this day. They began crafting writing systems to capture their ideas and their past. They generated art, stories, and spiritual practices. They were establishing the groundwork for all that came after: vast kingdoms, trading routes, scientific exploration, and schools of thought, the complete structure of human culture. And it all can be traced to one straightforward truth. When the glaciers disappeared and the planet changed forever, people did more than merely stay alive. They flourished. They seized disaster and transformed it into a chance for progress. They changed not only their implements and methods, but their complete mode of existence, forging a reality that their Pleistocene forebears could never have dreamed of. The era of the hunter had come to a close. The era of the planter, the constructor, the urbanite had started. And from that shift emerged the world in which we still live. Now, here's something truly astonishing. Across every land where people live, divided by vast seas and countless miles, numerous societies recount virtually the identical tale. A tale of water, of deluges that ruined the ancient world, of enduring against all hope, of the moment when everything underwent a transformation. The Gilgamesh epic, composed in old Mesopotamia more than 4 millennia ago, speaks of a massive deluge that engulfed the land. The deities caution a single man named Utnapishtim, who constructs an enormous vessel and rescues his relatives, creatures, and skilled workers. The floodwaters surge for 6 days and 7 nights. Once they eventually withdraw, humankind has to start anew. Does that ring a bell? The account of Noah's Ark from the Bible mirrors that pattern almost precisely. A virtuous man gets a message from a higher power. He constructs an ark. The waters arrive. All is annihilated but for what is kept safe inside the ship. Once the waters withdraw, the survivors populate the planet once more. However, this is not exclusive to Near Eastern societies. The Ojibwe tribe of North America recount the story of Nana Bio, who escapes a huge flood by ascending the highest tree. Afterward, he fashions a fresh world. The Mai people of New Zealand relate how the half-god Tahaki brought about enormous floods that altered the shape of the islands. Among Aboriginal Australians, there are numerous tales of flooding, with several recounting particular coastal landmarks now submerged. The Gunditj Mara community in southeastern Australia speaks of an era when one could stroll to a location that has since become an island. Prior to the ocean surging in and dividing the terrain, Chinese mythology recounts a great deluge that persisted for 2 generations, only ending when the legendary Yu the Great channeled the waters away via colossal engineering feats. Hindu scriptures depict Manu constructing a vessel to endure catastrophic floods that annihilate the world. Similarly, Greek myths speak of Deucalion and Pyrrha as the only ones to escape a flood unleashed by Zeus to wipe out mankind. For ages, academics regarded these narratives as mere mythology, allegories of divine retribution or cultural symbols of rebirth and renewal. Yet, what if they held a different truth? Could they be actual memories? The chronology aligns too perfectly to be dismissed. The majority of flood legends recount happenings from the distant past, during ancestral times, in an era when the world was unlike today. They depict swift, devastating floods, coastal submersion, and the disappearance of known terrains. They speak of refuges on mountain peaks and elevated lands where survivors awaited the retreat of the waters. This precisely corresponds to what we understand occurred from 20,000 to 6,000 years ago. That era saw the collapse of ice sheets and a 400-foot rise in sea levels. Meltwater floods repeatedly ravaged river valleys, and coastlines that had remained unchanged for thousands of years were abruptly drowned in what felt like geological eye blinks. Those who lived through these events lacked writing systems and couldn't document their experiences in books or databases. However, they possessed an equally potent tool: oral tradition, the capacity to pass down crucial knowledge across generations via tales, songs, and ritual instructions. Moreover, oral tradition proves far more resilient than commonly believed. Aboriginal Australians have preserved precise accounts of occurrences from more than 10,000 years ago. Linguists and anthropologists collaborating with tribal elders have recorded narratives depicting terrains now lying 150 feet beneath the sea. These tales describe walking to islands that today are divided by open water and freshwater springs that are now submerged offshore. A striking illustration originates from Port Phillip Bay in southern Australia. The Boonwurrung people recount an age when the bay was a level plain traversed by a river. They narrate how the sea burst through the heads, the bay's narrow inlet, and inundated the whole region. Geological investigations confirm that this is precisely what occurred approximately 10,000 years ago. Thousands of years back, ascending sea levels broke through the slim passage between the headlands, flooding the basin and forming the present-day bay. Comparable memories surface in indigenous traditions from Southeast Asia, where people mention voyaging between islands now divided by deep waters. Over in the Persian Gulf, the whole basin remained dry until roughly 8,000 years ago, when encroaching seas poured in through the Strait of Hormuz. Meanwhile, in the North Sea, British and Dutch fishing boats still sometimes haul up stone tools and mammoth bones from the former Doggerland. Doggerland was an inhabited terrain linking Britain to mainland Europe prior to its submergence by the ocean. These are not ambiguous mythological allusions. These intricate geographical recollections have been preserved across countless generations. They reveal something deep about human cultural memory. Humanity retains memories of catastrophe. When the world shifts drastically, when landscapes familiar for millennia abruptly change, we encode that knowledge into our most enduring cultural repository, stories. The flood myths go beyond merely recounting the deluges. They are fundamentally about survival. Nearly every rendition contains the same essential components: a warning received through dreams, divine messages, or interpretation of natural cues. They organize supplies and move to higher land, surviving the disaster. Thus, they became the forebears of a new era, the ones who passed down the memory of the event. This mirrors what actually happened to people during that shift. Those near coasts or river deltas would have noticed the changes gradually, over many years and generations, not suddenly. Tides grew higher, floods became more common, and known spots slowly vanished under the sea. Eventually, the wise communities that observed these patterns would have retreated inland, resettling on elevated land. They were likely the ones who survived and preserved the stories, yet oral accounts have limits. To find concrete proof, we turn to archaeology, and more, we're discovering it beneath the waves. Marine archaeology has uncovered many sunken settlements, globally clear evidence that our predecessors built homes in areas that today lie underwater. Near Israel's coast, divers found Atlet Yam, a Neolithic village submerged 26 feet deep. It's about 7,000 years old, with stone homes, a stone ring, and wells that still hold fresh water. The village was evidently left in a hurry. Food and tools remained, as the sea advanced quicker than inhabitants could adapt. In the Black Sea, surveys reveal preserved settlements on a former freshwater lakeshore. About 7,600 years ago, the Mediterranean rose and broke through the narrow Bosphorus, catastrophically flooding the Black Sea basin. Sea levels there surged by over 300 feet, inundating thousands of square miles of populated shoreline. Some scholars believe this may be the source of flood legends in Middle Eastern cultures. Witnessing it would be unforgettable. The North Sea has provided abundant evidence of Doggerland, the broad plain that once linked Britain with Europe. Fishing trawlers often haul up relics, worked flints, bone tools, and sometimes human bones from what used to be excellent hunting grounds. Under the sea are the ancient terrains where Mesolithic people hunted aurochs and red deer, collected shellfish, and set up seasonal camps. All were submerged as ice sheets melted and the North Sea formed. Off Florida, archaeologists found sinkholes that were freshwater ponds 12,000 years ago, when sea levels were far lower and Florida's coast stretched miles farther out. These ponds were used by Paleo-Indians for burials. Now, under 30 feet of water, they hold some of North America's oldest and most well-preserved human skeletons. Each year brings new discoveries. Underwater surveys with side-scan sonar and multi-beam mapping uncover ancient riverbeds now underwater, indicating where settlements once stood. Stone implements and pottery appear in locations submerged for millennia. This archaeological proof confirms the truth behind the ancient tales. The flood myths were preserved. Our ancestors saw and endured severe coastal flooding as the Ice Age came to a close. Yet, here, the tale grows unsettlingly timely. We're not only studying ancient events, we're glimpsing a forecast of what lies ahead for us. The warming that concluded the last ice age increased global temperatures by roughly 4 to 7 degrees Celsius over about 10,000 years. That equals an average warming of 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius per millennium. That may seem gradual, but the process wasn't steady. There were bursts of rapid warming, where temperatures soared several degrees within decades. The Younger Dryas termination about 11,700 years ago caused Greenland's temperature to climb 10 degrees Celsius in under 50 years. Today's global warming proceeds at roughly 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade. That's 2 degrees Celsius per century, 20 degrees Celsius per millennium, almost 30 times quicker than the average warming that ended the Ice Age. What used to unfold over millennia is now packed into just a few hundred years. The ancient warming had its roots in shifts in our planet's orbit. As Earth's orientation toward the sun changed, more solar energy slowly reached the northern half of the globe. This process was natural and followed predictable astronomical rhythms that have been at work for millions of years. In contrast, today's warming is driven by greenhouse gases, specifically carbon dioxide, from the burning of fossil fuels. This warming is human-made, and its pace is unmatched by anything seen in the ancient ice core data. Scientists have extracted ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland that contain trapped bubbles of air from up to 800,000 years ago. These ice cores reveal precisely what the atmosphere held through many glacial cycles. During ice ages, the concentration of carbon dioxide usually stayed around 180 parts per million. In warmer interglacial eras, such as the one we currently inhabit, two levels climbed to roughly 280 parts per million. That difference of 100 parts per million was enough to push the planet between ice, ages, and warm intervals. Today, the concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is above 420 parts per million. That is a full 50% more than the highest natural readings seen over the last 800 millennia. We have driven our atmosphere to conditions not seen since the Pliocene epoch. More than 3 million years ago, oceans stood 50 to 80 feet higher than now, and the Arctic had no summer ice. Old climate records give us a vital lesson about tipping points. Climate change is not a gentle, gradual process. It happens in abrupt shifts. Natural systems can stay stable for a long time, absorbing disturbances and keeping balance until they suddenly cannot. They then switch to a different mode, frequently in a very short time. This pattern is clear in the ice core data. Rising temperatures do not follow a smooth line. They advance like a staircase. Extended stretches of calm are broken by steep increases. These shifts occur when feedback cycles become active. When ice melts, it uncovers darker land or water that soaks up more sunlight, causing further melting. Thawing permafrost releases methane gas. That methane warms the air, which in turn melts more permafrost. Ocean currents alter their paths, redistributing heat around the planet and leading to more changes. As the last ice age ended, the climate encountered several tipping points. Each one made warming stronger, sped up ice melting, and raised sea levels more quickly. The troubling part is that we can spot similar tipping points on the horizon for today's climate. The Greenland ice sheet is shedding mass at faster and faster speeds. Sea ice in the Arctic is shrinking much quicker than what computer models forecasted. Permafrost in Siberia and northern Canada is thawing and emitting carbon. Rainforests face increasingly common dry spells that kill trees and free up carbon they had stored. In the ancient warming, negative feedbacks eventually put a brake on the temperature rise. In time, the great ice sheets vanished entirely. Ocean levels steadied, and the climate settled into a new balance. Yet this transformation needed more than 10,000 years. During that journey, it wiped out most Ice Age giant animals and pushed human populations to migrate and adapt on a huge scale. We are setting off comparable changes, but far more quickly. The real question is not if the seas will rise, they will, but how much and how fast. The ice sheets are currently shedding mass. What remains uncertain is just how quickly and to what extent that will happen. Cautious predictions point to a sea level increase of between 3 and 6 feet by the year 2100. However, more extreme forecasts, grounded in the possibility of ice sheet collapse, indicate that rises of 10 feet or even more are not out of the question. Under either possibility, coastlines currently home to hundreds of millions of people would be flooded. When sea levels rose, our forebears responded by migrating inward, settling on higher ground and venturing into fresh lands. That was possible only because the human population at the close of the Ice Age was minuscule, likely between 5 and 10 million worldwide. Vast stretches of the earth remained uninhabited. One could simply leave a coastal village that had been swamped and, after a week's journey, come upon territory that belonged to no one. That luxury is no longer ours. Today, the planet is home to more than 8 billion inhabitants. The majority of coastal land has long since been claimed, farmed, and developed. Future climate refugees will not find untouched wilderness waiting for them. They will instead be vying for room in areas already stretched to their limits. Another lesson from that ancient climatic shift concerns the delicacy of ecosystems. The extinction of giant animals was driven not solely by human hunting. It also involved the profound restructuring of ecosystems and the unraveling of food chains. The connections among species that had endured for hundreds of millennia began to fall apart as climates transformed and habitats altered. Nowadays, we are observing the initial hints of a comparable transformation. As the oceans warm, coral reefs are experiencing bleaching events. Meanwhile, forests are dying off in response to changing patterns of drought. Schools of fish are heading toward the poles. When tropical seas exceed the temperature limits these creatures can endure, those unable to relocate or adjust quickly enough vanish. Extinction is final, the same as it was for mammoths, giant ground sloths, and dire wolves. According to the fossil evidence, large-scale mass extinctions leave a permanent mark, and the vanished species never return. Throughout the late Pleistocene, the creatures that went extinct did not reappear. Over enormous spans of time, new species do arise to occupy those vacant ecological roles, but such evolution demands tens of thousands or even millions of years. From a human perspective, extinction really is irreversible. Yet maybe the greatest insight from that earlier climatic shift concerns the interplay between human resilience and human hardship. Certainly, our predecessors endured. They adjusted their tools, altered how they hunted, identified new provisions, and ultimately flourished in the world that emerged after the glaciers. The dawn of agriculture, the emergence of civilizations, and all subsequent developments rested upon the stable climate that came after the ice. However, the era of transition itself was harsh and unforgiving. Archaeological findings point to a rise in conflict, fiercer competition for resources, dramatic declines in population numbers, and the desertion of whole areas. Genetic bottlenecks visible in human DNA from that era reveal that our species endured severe shrinkages. Not every group managed to survive. We trace our lineage back to those who did pull through, but that survival exacted a heavy price. The stories of great floods that have been handed down through cultures are not merely accounts of water overwhelming the land. They speak of loss, the disappearance of known landscapes, ancestral homelands, and ways of living that had endured across many generations. These tales deal with deep pain, the grief of leaving the lands of your ancestors, of seeing familiar places fade away, and of not knowing if you would ever find new dwelling places, fresh hunting areas, and new supplies of food and water. Our forebears managed to survive because they were adaptable, could move easily, and kept their populations small. Whenever necessary, they simply picked up and relocated. Their tools and knowledge were basic enough that they could start over from nothing if they had to. Their communities were also small, making it fairly simple to move from one place to another. Thanks to these benefits, they managed to endure a shift in climate that would have wiped out species less capable of adapting. Our current human civilization possesses its own set of strengths and its own weaknesses. We now have far more advanced technology at our disposal. We also have a deep understanding of climate science. We are able to simulate possible futures and maybe get ready for what's coming. We also benefit from worldwide communication links, transport systems, and organizations that, at least in theory, could organize large efforts to adapt. However, we have become much less mobile. The places we've built our cities, farms, and factories cannot be moved without tremendous difficulty. Our existence relies on intricate supply networks that stretch across entire continents. We've also divided ourselves into countries with strict boundaries and often conflicting priorities. And there are a lot of us, 8 billion human beings, each requiring food, water, shelter, and materials. The climate shift that happened long ago unfolded over millennia. That slow pace allowed both natural habitats and human communities to adapt little by little. Today, the push on our climate is occurring so rapidly that adjusting will be hard for nature and for people alike. What lies ahead is not a slow shift spanning many generations. Instead, we're dealing with drastic alterations within one lifetime. The flood stories kept alive through generations remind us that our ancestors experienced periods of enormous environmental transformation. They saw their world change, learned to adapt, made it through, and eventually flourished. Yet these tales also serve as a reminder that those changes were truly catastrophic. They were happening so painful that they were etched into the collective memory for millennia, getting handed down as warnings from one generation to the next. Don't forget the floods. They show us that the world is capable of shifting, and that making it through demands readiness, adaptability, and at times, tough decisions. Today, we are experiencing our own climate shift. We possess benefits our predecessors didn't have: scientific understanding, advanced tools, and worldwide collaboration, at least in principle. However, we also confront problems they never faced: an overcrowded globe, intricate interconnected networks, and alterations occurring more quickly than natural adaptation can match. The ice cores and historical climate data aren't merely scientific oddities, they are textbooks. They instruct us that our planet's climate is delicate and can undergo swift, major changes. These records reveal what critical thresholds resemble, how tiny alterations can be magnified by feedback cycles into large-scale restructurings, and they prove that extinction is a genuine and irreversible reality. They provide evidence that once sea levels begin to rise, the process can persist for thousands of years, even after the temperature stops increasing. Above all, they remind us that our climate is not an abstract concept. It isn't only about temperature charts and computer simulations. It's about landscapes being reshaped, shorelines being submerged, ecosystems falling apart, people moving from their homes, communities being torn apart, and entire ways of life coming to an end. These are the genuine human impacts that our ancestors went through and then passed down in their most lasting tales. The planet has seen dramatic transformation before, and it is undergoing dramatic transformation once more. The issue is not whether we can get through climate change. Our species has already demonstrated its ability to adapt. Instead, the real question is what sort of world we will live in and how much we will end up losing on the journey. Whether we will listen to the warnings etched in ancient tales and current research is still uncertain. Those great floods that our forebears endured have left scars that still exist today. Submerged shorelines are now being studied by archaeologists. There are genetic traces of population declines, mythological stories carrying cultural memories, and knowledge locked away in ice cores and sedimentary deposits. These are echoes from an era when the planet underwent radical change and nothing stayed the same. We are now generating our own kind of echoes. If we manage to survive the upcoming changes, future generations will investigate our era, interpreting our climate data, digging up our towns, and reading our documents. They will wonder about what we understood, what actions we took, and what we forfeited. That ancient shift closed one chapter and opened another, and our own era is bound to follow the same pattern. What we still need to decide is what we keep and what we are ready to release. So here we are, standing at the closing stages of one of the most extreme changes our planet has ever experienced. 12 millennia ago, the Earth was trapped in an icy grip, with enormous glaciers stretching across 1/3 of all land. Oceans were 400 feet lower than current levels, and herds of mammoths roamed across icy plains that extended from present-day France all the way to Alaska. Saber-toothed tigers roamed territories that would eventually turn into shopping centers and urban hubs. Then, in a flash of geological time, everything transformed. Glaciers thawed, oceans swelled, coastal areas were submerged. Whole ecosystems broke apart and reorganized, and the huge animals that had ruled the earth for countless millennia vanished. They fell victim to erratic climate conditions and hunting pressures from people that proved too much for them. In a mere few millennia, the icy landscape that characterized the Pleistocene era simply disappeared. In its place came the warm, verdant, and fairly steady earth that we now call home. This is the Holocene, our age, the world we perceive as ordinary, yet there is nothing truly ordinary about it. The past 12,000 years have been among the most consistent climate phases in the past 1 million years. The extreme temperature fluctuations typical of the Ice Age, those dramatic alternations between freezing and moderate conditions that could occur over just a few decades, largely ceased. The seasons grew more reliable, ocean levels settled down, and the climate found a rhythm that, aside from minor local differences, has stayed impressively stable. That steadiness allowed everything else to emerge. Still, farming cannot take root if the climate is liable to undergo disastrous changes every couple of generations. Constructing lasting communities is impossible when oceans might climb 20 feet in 100 years, and you cannot stockpile the extra resources needed for an advanced society if you are always hurriedly adjusting to shifting environments. Our forebears, however, were shaped by a population bottleneck formed through hundreds of millennia of environmental challenges, and they were prepared. They possessed the mental adaptability, inventive tools, social structures, and communication abilities required to take advantage of this newly stable planet. Only a few millennia after the Ice Age concluded, they established farming in at least 7 separate regions across the world: the Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River Valley, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Sub-Saharan Africa, New Guinea, and Eastern North America. Wherever Homo sapiens resided, they learned to grow crops and tame animals. From that point onward, progress sped up. Fixed settlements turned into hamlets, hamlets into towns, and towns into cities. Having extra food from farming enabled job specialization. No longer did every individual need to devote all their energy to acquiring food. Some could become artisans, religious leaders, warriors, and officials. Social ranks appeared. Writing was invented to monitor supplies and preserve knowledge. And market routes grew to exchange products over vast areas, across entire continents. Within 8,000 years after the glaciers pulled back, people advanced from tiny nomadic groups of foragers to constructing ziggurats in Mesopotamia and pyramids in Egypt. The very same species that had gotten by on meager resources during the Ice Age was now erecting grand structures, developing elaborate government systems, and crafting refined artworks. This metamorphosis had no parallel in Earth's biological history, yet it carried a price. Those splendid animals that had endured many ice ages were unable to survive alongside humanity in a warming environment. The woolly mammoths, mastodons, enormous ground sloths, saber-toothed tigers, dire wolves, and short-faced bears all vanished. Certain species disappeared as their glacial environments faded away, while others were hunted by humans who had grown overly skilled, populous, and advanced in technology. In both cases, the outcome remained identical: extinction. Vast terrains also vanished, and the Bering Land Bridge, the essential pathway that enabled human migration into the Americas, was submerged by rising ocean waters. The enormous continental shelves that once served as abundant hunting and foraging areas along all shorelines sank beneath the waves. The mammoth steppe biome that had extended throughout the northern hemisphere gave way to woodlands and tundra. Lifestyles that had supported human communities for tens of millennia were wiped out within a few hundred years. Our forebears grieved these disappearances, and we are certain of this because they preserved the memories. Cultural recollections of massive floods, of territories engulfed by the ocean, of an era when enormous creatures roamed the earth. Such tales are found in oral histories globally. Indigenous Australians recall a time when walking to Tasmania was possible. Native communities in Southeast Asia remember when the archipelago was linked. Deluge legends from numerous societies hold bits of authentic historical recollection, altered and embellished across millennia, yet grounded in actual occurrences that influenced human thought. We have inherited all of this: the planet we inhabit, the steady climate we have benefited from, the farming methods that sustain 8 billion individuals, the urban centers, the innovations, the whole framework of contemporary society. Everything constructed upon the foundation of that post-Ice Age transformation. We are the descendants of the survivors, those who made it through the bottleneck, who adapted to the thaw, who learned to flourish in a world that had ceased trying to endanger them at every step. However, we are now encountering our own period of change. The climatic steadiness that enabled civilization to arise is coming to an end. Not due to natural processes this time, but because of our own deeds. We are running an experiment on Earth's climate system that will reveal if we have inherited sufficient resilience from our forebears to endure the transformations we have set in motion. That is a narrative for a different occasion. For now, find comfort in the knowledge that humanity has endured far more severe hardships. Far more severe. We bear the genetic heritage of those 280 individuals who refused to give up when all appeared hopeless. We possess the mental faculties, technological abilities, and communication networks that they could never have dreamed of. If they managed to survive 117,000 years of environmental disaster using only stone implements and resolve, perhaps, just perhaps, we can find a way to steer through whatever lies ahead. If you appreciated this expedition into ancient epochs, please think about giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing for additional explorations into history. Drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what aspect of Ice Age history fascinated you. The vanishing of the megafauna, the flood incidents, and the human responses. Until we meet again, rest peacefully, dream about woolly mammoths and thawing ice sheets. Keep in mind that you belong to the most enduring narrative of survival in history.